Rain hit the ground like small stones, and Elira Voss ran through it with her arms full of wet cloth sacks, her boots sinking into mud with every step. Behind her, a dog barked twice, sharp and sudden, and she flinched without slowing down. She had one thought only: get home before the market gate closed, and the guards locked the outer road for the night. If she missed the gate, she would have to walk the long way, past the old mill, where travelers said strange howls rose from the trees after dark. She turned a corner too fast, and slammed into a wooden post outside the Grey Hollow Tavern. Pain shot up her shoulder. She dropped one of her sacks, and onions rolled into the mud, disappearing into brown puddles. She swore under her breath, and bent down to grab what she could, her fingers freezing, her hair stuck flat against her face from the rain. A cloak lay near her feet, dark green, heavy wool, thrown carelessly across a bench outside the tavern door, as if someone had tossed it there without a second thought. She didn't look up. She didn't have time to look up. Her boots were caked thick with mud from the road, and without thinking, she wiped them against the edge of that cloak, once, twice, scraping the filth off so she wouldn't track it through her own front door later. She never saw the man standing 3 steps away, half hidden by the tavern's low doorway, watching her. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched a stranger clean her boots on a cloak worth more than most houses in that village. And something in his chest, something that had been tight and cold for a very long time, loosened just slightly. Elira scooped up the last onion, tucked it into her sack, and straightened up, brushing wet strands of hair from her eyes. That was when she finally saw him. He was tall, taller than most men in the village, with dark hair damp from the rain, and eyes the color of a storm just before it breaks. He wore simple traveling clothes, nothing fine, nothing that marked him as anyone important. But something about the way he stood, still and unbothered by the storm around him, made her stomach twist with a feeling she couldn't name. "Sorry," she said quickly, nodding at the cloak on the bench, though she still didn't realize it belonged to him. Didn't mean to make more mess. He tilted his head slightly. "It is only cloth," he said. His voice was low, calm, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to be heard. She frowned at him for half a second, confused by how easily he said it, then shook her head and hurried past him toward the market gate, which was already beginning to close. She didn't look back. He did. Cade Ashvale watched her disappear into the crowd of last-minute shoppers and cart pullers, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something close to amusement pull at the corner of his mouth. Nobody spoke to him like that. Nobody wiped mud on anything of his without an apology so long it became its own kind of performance. Nobody looked at him and saw only a stranger standing in the rain. He liked it. He should not have liked it. Cade was not supposed to be in this village at all. 2 days ago, he had slipped away from his own guards under the cover of night, leaving behind a note that said only that he required time to think, and that his second-in-command, a broad-shouldered wolf named Garrick, was to handle matters until his return. It was not the first time he had done something like this, but it was the first time he had done it while whispers of betrayal moved through his own council chambers like smoke under a door. Someone close to him wanted his throne. He did not yet know who. He had come north, to the smaller villages near the border, hoping distance and silence might sharpen his instincts, might let him hear the truth beneath the noise of flattery that surrounded him every day in his own halls. Everyone in his court smiled at him. Everyone bowed. Everyone told him exactly what he wanted to hear, and none of it meant anything. The girl with the onions had told him nothing he wanted to hear. She had not even looked at him twice. He picked the cloak up off the bench, mud streaked across the hem, and instead of calling for someone to clean it, he simply folded it over his arm and walked into the tavern, taking a seat near the fire. The innkeeper, a heavy-set woman with flour still on her hands, glanced at him without any particular interest, which suited him fine. He ordered a bowl of stew and said nothing else, listening instead to the conversations around him. "Say the king's been seen near the northern road," one man muttered to another 2 tables over. "Traveling alone, if you believe it." "Alphas don't travel alone," the second man said, laughing into his cup. "Not with half his own council wanting his seat. My cousin works the eastern gate, says there's already talk of Baron Crane making moves while the king's away." Cade kept his eyes on the fire, his jaw tightening only slightly. Aldrich Crane. He had suspected as much, but hearing it spoken so plainly, so carelessly, by 2 strangers in a tavern who had no idea the king himself sat 3 tables away, confirmed something cold and sharp in his gut. He would need to move carefully. He would need more than suspicion before he returned to the capital, and forced a confrontation that could tear his council in half. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, his mind kept drifting back to a girl in the rain, with mud on her boots, and no idea who she had just been rude to. He found himself asking the innkeeper, in the most casual voice he could manage, if she knew of a girl who came through with market sacks around sundown, dark hair, quick temper judging by the way she cursed at fallen onions. The innkeeper snorted. That'll be Alira Voss. Works for old Mistress Hale up on Miller's Row, when she's not running her own errands. Good girl, sharp tongue. Raising her little sister mostly on her own since their mother passed. Why do you ask, stranger? No reason, Cade said, and finished his stew in silence, though the name sat in his mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending small ripples outward, that he could not yet explain. Alira, meanwhile, had made it through the gate, just as the guards began pulling it shut, earning a sharp look from the man on duty, and a muttered warning, not to cut it so close next time. She hurried the rest of the way home, a small stone cottage at the edge of Miller's Row, where a single candle burned in the front window. Her sister Mira, 12 years old with the same dark hair and quick eyes, was waiting at the door before Alira even reached it. You're late, Mira said, though there was more relief in her voice than complaint. I was starting to think the wolves got you. The wolves have better things to do than chase after onions, Alira said, stepping inside and setting her sacks down on the wooden table. She peeled off her wet cloak and hung it near the fire, rubbing warmth back into her arms. Sorry, got held up in town. Almost didn't make the gate. Mira was already digging through the sacks, pulling out bread and a small wedge of cheese, her stomach clearly louder than her patience. Did you hear the talk? She asked, mouth half full already. Everyone's saying the Alpha King is somewhere close. My friend Petra said her uncle saw a man matching his description near the old mill road. Alira rolled her eyes as she set a pot over the fire. People say that every few months. Last year it was supposedly a royal spy hiding in the grain stores. The year before that, someone swore the king's own brother was living above the blacksmith shop. She shook her head, amused. Kings don't wander around villages like ours, Mira. They have people for that. Guards, messengers, whatever else. If the Alpha King ever set foot in this mud, I doubt he'd survive the smell of old Bram's fish stall. She didn't know, of course, that she had already stood 3 feet from him, that she had wiped her boots clean on the very cloak that marked him as someone far above the market crowd she moved through every day. She didn't know that somewhere across the village, in a firelit tavern, the man she had dismissed without thought was turning her name over in his mind, like something rare he wasn't sure he was allowed to keep. That night, as the rain finally slowed to a quiet patter against the roof, Alira lay awake longer than usual, staring at the low ceiling of the cottage, her sister's soft breathing beside her. She thought, briefly, of the tall stranger outside the tavern, the way his eyes hadn't left her even after she walked away, the strange calm in his voice when he said, "It is only cloth." She told herself it meant nothing. Strangers passed through the village all the time, merchants and travelers and the occasional lost hunter looking for the eastern road. There was no reason a single quiet moment with a man in the rain should linger in her mind the way it did. And yet it did. Across the village, in a small room above the tavern, that he had paid for with coin instead of command, Cade Ashvale sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, thinking of a girl who had looked at him, and seen nothing but a stranger standing too close to a bench. For a man who had spent his entire life being seen, being measured, being either feared or flattered by every set of eyes that landed on him, there was something almost unbearably freeing in being looked at and dismissed. He should return to the capital, he knew that. Every day he stayed away was another day Baron Crane had to whisper doubt into the ears of council members who were already too easily swayed by comfort and fear. But something kept him rooted to this village a little longer. Some instinct he did not fully trust himself to name yet, though it wore the shape of dark hair and mud-streaked boots, and a voice that hadn't once trembled in his presence. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would find a reason to see her again. Not as a king, not yet. Just as a stranger the rain had left behind. Outside, the storm passed, and the village settled into an uneasy quiet, unaware that its ordinary streets had just become the meeting point of 2 lives that were about to collide in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Far to the south, in the stone halls of the capital, A different kind of quiet held the night. Baron Aldrich Crane stood alone, in a private chamber, lit by a single lamp, a folded letter in his hand, its wax seal already broken. He read the words a second time, then a third, his expression unreadable in the low light. The letter carried news from a contact inside the king's own guard, someone paid well to whisper information that should never have left the palace walls. "The king is gone," the letter said. "No destination given, no date of return." Crane allowed himself a small, careful smile. Opportunity rarely announced itself so clearly. He folded the letter again and fed it to the lamp's flame, watching the paper curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. Then he called for his steward, a thin, nervous man named Ellery who had served the Crane family for over a decade and knew better than to ask questions he wasn't meant to ask. "Send word to the council members we discussed," Crane said quietly. "Tell them the king's absence has gone on long enough to raise concern. Tell them a temporary hand may be needed to steady the realm while he is found." Ellery bowed and left without a word, and Crane returned his attention to the window, looking out over the sleeping city that did not yet know how close it stood to change. He had waited a long time for a crack to appear in Cade Ashvale's rule. He did not intend to let it close before he had pried it wide open. Back in the village, morning came slowly, gray light creeping over the rooftops, as the last of the rain dripped from the eaves. Elira woke before Mira, as she always did, and moved quietly through the small cottage, stirring the fire back to life, and setting a pot of oats to warm. Her shoulder still ached faintly from the collision with the post the night before, and she rubbed at it absently as she worked, her mind drifting more than she wanted to admit toward a stranger's calm voice and unreadable eyes. She told herself, firmly, that it was nothing. Villages like hers saw travelers come and go constantly, merchants heading toward the coast, hunters passing through on their way to the northern woods, occasional wanderers with no particular purpose at all. There was no reason one quiet exchange outside a tavern should sit so heavily in her thoughts. And yet, as she walked to Mistress Hale's house later that morning, sacks of fresh bread balanced against her hip, she found her eyes scanning the street without meaning to, searching faces in the early crowd for one that did not belong. She did not see him. She told herself she was relieved. She was not entirely honest with herself about that. Mistress Hale, a stern old woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, greeted Elira at the door with her usual mixture of impatience and grudging fondness. "You're later than usual," she said, though she stepped aside to let Elira in regardless. "Rain slow you down, or was it the gossip? Half the market's talking about strangers on the northern road again." "It's always something with this village," Elira said, setting the bread down on the kitchen table. "Last month it was ghosts in the old mill. Now it's kings hiding in ditches. People need better things to worry about." Mistress Hale chuckled, a dry, rasping sound, and shuffled toward her chair by the window. "Careful saying that too loudly, girl. Even old ears like mine remember a time when careless words about the crown brought trouble to a person's door. The Ashvale line has never been known for patience with disrespect." Elira paused for half a second, an odd chill brushing along her arms that she couldn't quite explain, before shaking it off and returning to her work. She had no way of knowing how close that warning had come to the truth, no way of knowing that disrespect toward the crown was precisely what she had offered, without a second thought the night before, wiped carelessly into the mud, along with the rain and the mess of fallen onions. Across the village, Cade Ashvale stood at the tavern's back window, watching smoke rise from morning chimneys, his mind already working through the pieces of a plan he had not yet fully decided to follow. He knew he should send word to Garrick soon, confirm that the capital remained steady, that Crane's ambitions had not yet moved beyond whispers and closed-door meetings. He knew every day he lingered here added risk to a throne already balanced on uncertain ground. But he also knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he was not yet ready to leave. Not until he understood why a girl with mud on her boots and no fear in her voice had unsettled something in him that years of council meetings, assassination attempts, and carefully worded threats had never managed to touch. He reached for his cloak, still faintly stained at the hem, and decided that today, disguised as nothing more than a traveler passing through, he would find a reason to see Elira Voss again. A scream cut through Miller's Row before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, sharp and sudden, and Elira dropped the basket of eggs she was carrying, 3 of them cracking against the stone step at her feet. She spun toward the sound, heart slamming, and saw a crowd already gathering near the well at the center of the row, voices rising over one another in confusion and alarm. She pushed through the small crowd and found Mira at the center of it, pale and shaking, pointing at something half-hidden behind the well's stone wall. A man lay there, unconscious, blood matting the side of his head, his clothes torn, as though he had been dragged across rough ground. Illyra recognized him. Old Bram, who ran the fish stall near the market gate, a man well past 60, who had never harmed anyone in his life. He was just lying there, Mira said, her voice trembling. I came to fetch water, and he was just lying there. Before Illyra could kneel to check him, a hand closed gently but firmly around her arm, pulling her back a step. She turned, ready to snap at whoever had grabbed her, and found herself staring up into the same storm-gray eyes from the night before. Don't touch him yet, Cade said quietly, releasing her arm as soon as she steadied. Look at the ground around him first. Illyra frowned, but something in his tone made her pause instead of argue. She looked down and saw it, deep gouges in the mud near Bram's body, too wide and too deep to have been made by any dog she knew. Her stomach turned cold. Wolf, she said quietly. Not an ordinary one, Cade said, crouching beside the old man and checking his pulse with careful, practiced hands. This wasn't a hunt. Look at the pattern of the wounds. Whatever did this wanted him found, not eaten. The crowd around them murmured louder, fear spreading fast through the small gathering. Someone ran to fetch the village healer. Someone else shouted for the gate guards. Illyra knelt beside Cade without fully deciding to, watching his hands move with a calm precision that seemed strange for a simple traveler. You know a lot about wolf attacks for someone just passing through, she said, eyes narrowing slightly, even as worry for Bram outweighed her suspicion. Cade didn't look up. I've seen enough of them to know the difference between an animal defending territory and something sent as a warning. A warning, Illyra repeated. For who? He didn't answer that. Instead, he lifted Bram carefully, cradling the old man with a strength that seemed almost too easy for someone his size, and carried him toward the healer's house without waiting for permission. Illyra followed, Mira close behind her, both of them too shaken to argue about propriety or strangers overstepping their place. The healer, a wiry woman named Petra's aunt, who went simply by Old Win, took one look at Bram's wounds and paled. These aren't from any wolf that hunts these woods, she muttered, pressing cloth against the injury on his head. We haven't had a true wolf attack near this village in 15 years, not since the border treaties were signed. Border treaties don't mean much if someone wants them broken, Cade said, standing near the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Old Win glanced at him sharply. And what would a traveler know about border treaties? Enough to worry, Cade said simply, and offered nothing further. Illyra watched him carefully, the pieces of something not quite fitting together in her mind. A stranger who spoke calmly of wolf attacks and political warnings, who carried an unconscious man like he weighed nothing, who had eyes that missed nothing and gave away even less. She should have been afraid of him. Instead, she found herself standing closer, some instinct telling her that whatever else he was not the danger here. By midday, Bram had woken enough to speak, though his words came slow and confused. He remembered walking toward the well before dawn to fetch water for his stall, remembered a shape moving too fast between the buildings, remembered pain, and then nothing else. The village guards searched the surrounding woods and found nothing but more of those same deep gouges in the mud, trailing off toward the northern border and vanishing entirely near the old mill road. Fear settled over Miller's Row like a second layer of fog. Doors that had stood open all summer were shut and bolted before sundown. Parents kept children close. Talk of the Alpha King's disappearance mixed uneasily with talk of the attack, and more than one voice in the market that afternoon wondered aloud if the two were somehow connected. Illyra found herself walking home slower than usual that evening, Mira gripping her hand tightly, both of them glancing at shadows that had never bothered them before. She didn't notice Cade following at a careful distance until they reached their own street, and even then, she only realized it because Mira tugged her sleeve and whispered that the tall stranger from the well was watching them from across the road. Illyra turned to face him directly this time, tired of pretending she hadn't noticed. Are you following us? Making sure you reach your door safely, Cade said. Given the morning's events, I didn't think it wise to leave two girls walking alone after dark. We've walked alone plenty of nights before, Elira said, though there was less bite in her voice than she intended. We don't need a stranger's protection. Perhaps not, Cade agreed easily. But you have it regardless, tonight. Mira, less guarded than her older sister, spoke up before Elira could argue further. You carried Bram like he weighed nothing. Are you a soldier? Something like that, Cade said, a faint, careful smile touching his mouth, the first real softness Elira had seen on him since the rain outside the tavern. What's your name? Mira pressed, curiosity overtaking caution, the way it only could for a 12-year-old unafraid of strangers. He hesitated only a moment. Cade, he said, just that. No family name, no title. Nothing that might reveal the weight the single word carried in every other corner of the realm. I'm Mira. That's my sister Elira. Mira grinned, entirely unbothered by her sister's obvious discomfort at the exchange. She wiped mud on your cloak last night, you know. I heard her telling Petra about the rude stranger she almost knocked over outside Grey Hollow. Elira's face went hot with embarrassment. Mira. Cade's smile widened just slightly, amusement flickering behind those storm-colored eyes. I remember, he said. It's only cloth. That's what you said last night too, Elira muttered, unsure whether to feel annoyed or oddly disarmed by how little the whole thing seemed to bother him. They reached the cottage, and Cade stopped a respectful distance from the door, making no move to follow them inside, or linger longer than seemed appropriate. Bolt your door tonight, he said, his tone shifting back to something more serious. Whatever attacked Bram this morning wasn't hunting for food. Until we know what it wanted, it's safer to assume the danger hasn't passed. We, Elira repeated, catching the word. You're planning to look into this yourself? I have my reasons, Cade said, and something in the way he said it, quiet and certain, made her believe he meant it far more seriously than a simple traveler passing through should have any right to. She watched him walk back down the darkening street until he disappeared around the corner, and only then did she usher Mira inside and slide the heavy iron bolt across the door, her mind turning over everything that had happened since the rain the night before. A stranger who spoke of border treaties and political warnings, a wolf attack too precise to be an accident, a missing king whose absence had somehow become the talk of every corner of the village within a single day. She told herself the two things were unrelated. She told herself a lot of things that night, lying awake long after Mira had drifted into uneasy sleep beside her, listening to the wind rattle against the shutters and wondering, despite every instinct telling her not to, what exactly Cade knew that he wasn't saying. Across the village, in the small room above the tavern, Cade sat with a folded map spread across the table, marking the location of the attack against the border lines. He knew better than any man alive. The gouges, leading toward the mill road, troubled him more than he had let on to Elira. That direction led nowhere useful for an ordinary predator. It led, if followed far enough, straight toward one of the old crossing points his own border patrols had quietly reinforced years ago, after a string of disputes with a neighboring pack, whose loyalty to the treaty had always been uncertain at best. If someone had sent a warning shaped like a wolf attack, timed precisely to coincide with rumors of his own disappearance, it meant whoever orchestrated it either knew he was nearby, or wanted the border packs to believe the Crown's protection had already begun to fail. Either possibility was worse than the last. He thought of Garrick back in the capital, likely furious by now at his continued silence, and knew he could not delay much longer without risking real damage to the fragile balance holding his court together. But he also could not walk away from a threat unfolding this close to a village that had, without knowing it, offered him the first honest days he'd had in longer than he cared to admit. He folded the map and set it aside, staring instead at the low fire crackling in the small room's hearth, turning over a decision he suspected would change far more than a few quiet days spent hiding from his throne. Tomorrow, he would send word north to test whether his suspicion about the crossing point held any truth. And whatever the answer turned out to be, he intended to make certain that Elira Voss and her sister remained far from whatever storm was building along that border, even if it meant staying close enough to watch over them himself, a king with no crown visible, guarding two girls who still had no idea how much danger had just found their quiet, ordinary street. Far south, in the capital, Garrick paced the length of the king's empty council chamber, his patience worn thin after 2 days without word. He was a broad, steady wolf, gray at the temples despite being only a few years older than Cade, and he had served the Ashvale line long enough to know when silence meant caution and when it meant trouble. This silence felt like trouble. A junior guard entered, breathless, and bowed quickly before speaking. "Sir, Baron Crane has called an emergency session with 3 of the council elders. They're meeting in the eastern wing within the hour." Garrick's jaw tightened. "On whose authority?" "He's citing the king's prolonged absence, sir. Says the realm needs assurance of steady leadership until His Majesty returns." "His Majesty is not dead," Garrick said sharply, "and he is certainly not incapable of ruling, because he's taken a handful of days away from this chamber. Crane knows that better than anyone. Should I send word to stop the session?" Garrick considered it for a long moment, weighing the risk of appearing to suppress a legitimate council concern against the greater risk of letting Crane build momentum unchallenged. "No," he said finally. "Let them meet, but I will be standing in that room when they do, and I will remind every elder present exactly whose seat they're so eager to discuss filling." He strode out of the chamber, already composing in his mind the message he intended to send north the moment this crisis settled, a message urging Cade, in terms far less patient than protocol usually allowed, to return before Crane's whispers hardened into something no amount of loyalty could undo. Back in the village, morning arrived heavy with tension that had not existed a day before. Guards doubled their rounds along the outer wall. Merchants spoke in lowered voices, casting glances toward the northern road every time the wind shifted. Elira woke early again, her sleep thin and restless, and found herself standing longer than usual at the cottage window, scanning the street below, though she couldn't have said exactly what she was looking for. She told herself it wasn't Cade. She was fairly certain that wasn't entirely true. Mira noticed her sister's distraction over their small breakfast and grinned around a mouthful of bread. "You keep looking out that window like you're expecting someone." "I'm making sure the street's clear," Elira said, far too quickly. "After yesterday, it seems sensible." "Uh-huh." Mira's grin widened, entirely unconvinced, but she let the matter drop, too hungry and too young to press further, though the knowing look in her eyes lingered long enough to make Elira's ears burn. Elira spent the day at Mistress Hale's house as usual, though her focus wandered more than it should have, her hands slower at their tasks, her ears straining toward every sound outside that might belong to a familiar, calm voice. She caught herself twice glancing toward the window and scolded herself both times, reminding herself firmly that a stranger's brief kindness during a frightening morning meant nothing beyond simple decency, that she had no business turning it over in her mind like something precious. She almost believed herself. By the time she walked home that evening, the sky had turned the deep orange of a sun, sinking fast behind the hills, and she found Cade waiting near the well, not hiding, not pretending to be somewhere else by coincidence, simply standing there, as though he had every right to be exactly where he was. "You didn't have to wait for me," she said, though something in her chest eased at the sight of him regardless. "I wanted to make sure the street stayed quiet," he said, "and to tell you, I'll be leaving the village for a short while tomorrow. A few days, perhaps less." Something unexpected tightened in her stomach at those words, something that felt uncomfortably close to disappointment. "Following up on your border treaty theory?" "Something like that," he said, echoing his earlier answer to Mira, giving away exactly as much as he intended, and not a word more. "Be careful," Elira said before she could stop herself, the words slipping out plain and honest, in a way that surprised her nearly as much as it seemed to surprise him. Cade studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his storm-gray eyes. "I intend to be," he said quietly. "I have a reason to return, now that I didn't have before." He didn't explain what he meant by that, and she didn't ask, though the words followed her home, and sat with her, long into the night, tangled up with worry over wolf attacks and border troubles, and a stranger, whose absence, she realized with quiet unease, she was already dreading before he had even left. 3 riders came through the northern gate at a hard gallop just after dawn, mud spraying from their horses' hooves, and the village guards scrambled to clear the road before someone was trampled. Elira, already awake and hauling water from the well, froze at the sight of them, her pulse jumping. She recognized the crest stitched across the lead rider's chest immediately. A silver wolf head against dark blue cloth. The Royal Guard. Whispers exploded through the street within minutes. The lead rider dismounted in front of the tavern and demanded to speak with anyone who might have seen a tall stranger traveling alone over the past several days. Elira's stomach dropped. She thought of Cade, gone since the morning before on whatever business he'd refused to fully explain, and felt a cold, creeping dread settle into her chest. She approached the rider before she could talk herself out of it. "What's this about?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The rider, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and a gray-streaked beard, studied her for a moment before answering. "We're searching for a man matching a specific description. Dark hair, gray eyes, traveling without escort. Have you seen anyone like that through this village?" Elira's mind raced. Every instinct told her to be careful with her answer, though she couldn't have said why. "Might have," she said carefully. "Why does the royal guard want him?" The rider's expression tightened, a flicker of something between exhaustion and worry crossing his weathered face. "That's not information for the street, girl. If you've seen him, tell me where, and quickly. It's a matter of the realm's safety." Before Elira could decide how much to reveal, a familiar voice cut through the gathering crowd. "You can stop searching, Garrick. I'm right here." Every head turned. Cade walked toward them from the direction of the northern road, his traveling clothes streaked with dust and something darker that might have been dried blood, though he moved without any visible injury. Elira's breath caught somewhere between relief and confusion as the guard she now understood to be named Garrick swung down from his horse and crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, dropping into a deep, immediate bow. "Your Majesty!" Garrick said, loud enough for half the street to hear. "Thank the moon you're unharmed." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, rippling outward through the crowd, through Elira's chest, through every quiet assumption she had built about the calm, careful stranger who had carried an injured old man and warned her to bolt her door. "Your Majesty, the Alpha King, Cade." She stared at him, unable to move, unable to speak, as the pieces slammed together with sickening clarity. The cloak she had wiped mud on outside the tavern. The easy authority in his voice when he spoke of border treaties and political warnings. The way he had walked through the village as though he belonged nowhere and everywhere at once, unbothered by mud, unbothered by disrespect that should have earned her nothing but punishment. Cade's eyes found hers across the gathered crowd, and something in his expression shifted, careful and apologetic all at once, though he said nothing to her directly. Not yet, not with half the village watching, and a royal guard waiting for his attention. "Report," Cade said to Garrick, his voice shifting into something harder, more commanding than she had heard from him before, a tone that made the entire crowd instinctively quiet. "Baron Crane called an emergency council session 2 days past," Garrick said, low enough that only those closest could hear. "Citing your absence as cause for concern, I stood in that room and reminded every elder present whose throne they were discussing, but the Baron has been gathering support quietly for weeks, Your Majesty. This absence gave him exactly the opening he needed." Cade's jaw tightened, storm-gray eyes darkening. "And the border? What did you find at the crossing point?" "Signs of movement," Garrick said. "Tracks matching nothing native to these woods. Whatever attacked the fishermen here wasn't acting alone, and it wasn't acting without direction." Elira listened, still frozen near the well, feeling suddenly, painfully aware of how small and ordinary her life must look from wherever a king actually stood. She thought of every casual word she had spoken to him, every complaint about pampered nobility, every joke about kings hiding in ditches that Mira had repeated with such delight. Her face burned with a mixture of humiliation and disbelief. Cade turned to her then, stepping away from Garrick despite the guard's obvious urgency, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. The crowd parted instinctively, murmurs rising around them, but Elira barely heard any of it. Her focus narrowed entirely on the man in front of her who was, impossibly, the Alpha King of the Northern Packs. "I should have told you," he said quietly, just for her. "You should have told me a lot of things," she said, her voice shaking with something that wasn't quite anger, though it wasn't far from it either. "I wiped mud on your cloak. I told you kings don't wander around villages like this one. I said you'd never survive the smell of old Bram's fish stall." A faint, tired smile touched his mouth despite everything. "You did say that." "This isn't funny," she said, though her voice cracked slightly on the words, humiliation and fear tangling together in her chest. "Do you have any idea what could happen to me for speaking to you like that? For treating you like some ordinary traveler?" Nothing is going to happen to you, Cade said, his voice firm, certain, the same calm authority she had noticed in him from the very first night, without understanding what it truly meant. You did nothing wrong. If anything, you gave me something I hadn't had in years. Honesty, without fear attached to it. Elira shook her head, stepping back despite the softness in his tone. You don't understand. Everyone in this village is going to know within the hour that I've been walking around town, arguing with the Alpha King like he was nobody. Mira told him he'd survive worse than fish stall smells. We joked about you. Elira. Her name and his voice stopped her mid-sentence. Quieter now, meant only for her, despite the crowd still watching from a careful distance. None of that matters to me. What matters is that Baron Crane has used my absence to move against my throne, and whatever attacked the fishermen here is connected to a threat building along my own border. I need to return to the capital, and quickly, but I did not want to leave this village, leave you, without you understanding the truth first. Garrick cleared his throat pointedly from several steps away. Your Majesty, we truly cannot delay. Cade held Elira's gaze a moment longer, something urgent and unspoken passing between them, before he finally stepped back, turning toward his waiting guard with the weight of the crown settling visibly back onto his shoulders. I'll return, he said, to her, or to the village, or perhaps simply to himself. It was hard to tell which. This isn't finished. He mounted the horse Garrick brought forward, and within minutes, the small group of royal riders thundered back out through the northern gate, leaving behind a village buzzing with disbelief, and a girl standing alone near the well, staring after them with her heart pounding somewhere between fear and an emotion she refused to name. Mira found her there minutes later, breathless from running, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and barely contained excitement. Elira, is it true? Was that really him? Was Cade really the— Yes, Elira said quietly, still staring at the empty road. It was really him. You told the Alpha King he'd never survive old Bram's fish stall, Mira said, half laughing, half stunned. You wiped mud on the Alpha King's cloak. I know, Mira. Elira pressed her hands against her face, humiliation and confusion churning together with something warmer, something she couldn't quite push away no matter how firmly she tried. I know exactly what I did. Word spread through the village faster than fire through dry grass, and by midday, Elira could not walk 2 steps without catching whispers, some awed, some scandalized, a few openly envious of the strange, impossible attention she had somehow drawn from a man none of them had ever expected to walk their muddy streets in disguise. Mistress Hale, when Elira arrived for her usual work, simply stared at her for a long moment, before shaking her head slowly. Well, the old woman said, I did warn you, the Ashvale line never had patience for disrespect. Seems I was wrong about at least part of that. Elira said nothing, too overwhelmed to form a proper response, and spent the rest of the day moving through her tasks in a fog, her mind replaying every moment since the rainy night outside Grey Hollow, searching for signs she should have noticed, and finding, uncomfortably, that perhaps some part of her already had. That evening, alone with Mira in the quiet cottage, she finally allowed herself to sit with the full weight of what had happened. A king had walked her streets, disguised as nothing. A king had carried an injured man with his own hands, had warned her to bolt her door, had told her, in a voice she now understood carried more danger and more power than she had ever imagined, that whatever existed between them was not finished. She did not know, sitting there in the flickering candlelight, whether to hope he was right, or to fear exactly how much trouble that truth was about to bring crashing into her small, ordinary life. 2 days south, the capital braced for the king's return, in a way that felt less like celebration, and more like tension drawn tight across a bowstring. Baron Aldrich Crane stood at the head of the council chamber, when word reached him that Cade had been found, alive, unharmed, and already riding hard for home. He kept his expression carefully neutral as the messenger delivered the news, though inwardly, he felt the opening he had spent weeks widening begin to narrow again, faster than he liked. Gather the elders who met with us before, Crane said quietly to Ellery, once the messenger had gone. There is still time to plant enough doubt before he reaches the gates. The king returns within the day, my lord, Ellery said carefully. Is it wise to continue, given how quickly this could be discovered? Crane's eyes narrowed. It is not discovery I fear, Ellery. It is inaction. A king who vanished without explanation for the better part of a week, who left his throne unguarded during a border incursion, does not return to unquestioning loyalty simply because he walks back through the gates. Doubt, once planted, does not vanish so easily. I intend to make certain of that. He moved through the halls with purpose, speaking quietly to council members who owed him old favors, reminding elders of the king's prolonged silence, suggesting gently, always gently, that perhaps the crown required steadier counsel during uncertain times. He said nothing outright disloyal, he never did. But by the time Cade's riders were spotted approaching the capital gates, a current of unease had settled over the court that no amount of the king's safe return could fully wash away. Cade felt it the moment he crossed into the palace courtyard, the subtle shift in how guards held themselves, the careful, measuring glances from council members gathered to greet him. He dismounted, weary from the hard ride, and found Garrick at his side immediately, voice low and urgent. "Crane has been busier than I feared," Garrick murmured. "Half the elders are asking why their king vanished during a border threat without so much as a message home." "Then I will answer them," Cade said, straightening despite his exhaustion, the weight of the crown settling back onto him with practiced ease. "Call the full council. I want Crane in that room when I explain myself, not whispering in corridors afterward." The council convened within the hour, and Cade stood before them, dust and travel still clinging to his clothes, and spoke plainly about the wolf attack near the northern village, the tracks leading toward the border crossing, the suspicion of movement from beyond the treaty lines that had demanded his quiet, unannounced investigation. He did not mention Alira. He did not mention mud on his cloak, or a girl who had looked at him and seen only a stranger. Some things, he decided, belonged to him alone, at least for now. Baron Crane listened with an expression of careful concern, nodding at the right moments, offering measured relief that His Majesty had returned unharmed, while still managing, through nothing more than a well-timed question here or a thoughtful pause there, to remind the room that a king who investigated threats alone, without informing his council, left the realm dangerously exposed should anything have gone wrong. Cade recognized the tactic for exactly what it was, patient poison delivered one careful drop at a time, and understood that Crane would not be stopped by a single council session or a single explanation, however reasonable. This was a long game, and the Baron had clearly been playing it far longer than Cade had realized. That night, alone in his own chambers for the first time in nearly a week, Cade stood at the window, overlooking the sprawling capital, and found his thoughts drifting north, despite every pressing concern demanding his attention. He thought of Alira's face when Garrick had bowed and spoken his title aloud, the shock and hurt tangled together in her eyes. He thought of her sharp voice outside the tavern, her honest confusion at Bram's bedside, the way she had told him to be careful without seeming to realize how much the words meant to a man who received calculated flattery, far more often than genuine concern. He had told her this wasn't finished. He intended to keep that promise, whatever it cost him, though the path ahead now stretched between two dangers that seemed determined to collide, a border threat sharpening beyond the northern treaty lines, and a Baron patient enough to wait for exactly the wrong moment to strike at the throne itself. Somewhere in the quiet dark of the palace, Cade made a decision he suspected would complicate everything even further. He would send for her. Not yet, not while the border remained unstable and Crane's influence still simmered dangerously close to open rebellion, but soon, once he understood exactly how much danger surrounded his crown, and exactly how much of it might follow anyone he chose to bring close to it. Hoofbeats thundered up Miller's Row, before sunrise, and Alira bolted upright in bed, heart hammering, certain for one terrifying moment that the wolf attack from days before had returned to finish what it started. Mira stirred beside her, groggy and confused, as the sound of a single rider drew closer, then stopped directly outside their cottage door. Alira grabbed the fire poker from beside the hearth before she even reached the door, some instinct refusing to let her open it unarmed. When she finally did, poker raised, ready for anything, she found instead a young royal messenger standing in the gray pre-dawn light, dressed in the same silver and blue crest she now recognized from Garrick's uniform days before. "Elira Voss?" the messenger asked, slightly out of breath. "Yes," she said cautiously, lowering the poker, but not fully releasing her grip on it. He held out a sealed letter, the wax stamped with a wolf's head pressed into deep blue. By order of His Majesty, I was told to deliver this directly and wait for your response, if you wish to send one. Elira's hands trembled slightly as she took the letter, her mind racing through every possibility, none of them steady enough to settle on. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded the parchment inside, Mira crowding close beside her, both of them reading by the thin gray light of morning. The words were simple, though the formality of the handwriting suggested they had been written and rewritten more than once before he settled on their final form. He wrote that the border situation had worsened since his return, that Baron Crane's influence within the council had grown bolder in his absence, and that he could not yet leave the capital to return north as he had hoped. But he asked, plainly and without pretense, whether she would consider traveling to the capital herself, under royal escort, so that their conversation might continue somewhere safer than a village, increasingly exposed to whatever threat moved along the border. He signed it simply, Cade, the same way he had introduced himself outside the tavern that first rainy night, no title attached, as though some part of him still wanted to be nothing more than a stranger to her. Elira read the letter twice, before looking up at the waiting messenger, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear, disbelief, and something warmer she still refused to name outright. He wants me to travel to the capital, she said slowly, mostly to herself. Under full royal escort, miss, the messenger confirmed. Whenever you're ready, whether that's today or a week from now. His Majesty was clear that the choice belongs entirely to you. Mira practically vibrated with excitement beside her. You have to go. Elira, this is the Alpha King, asking you to the capital. Do you understand what that means? I understand exactly what it means, Elira said, though her voice carried more uncertainty than her sister's enthusiasm allowed for. It means leaving you here alone, for one thing. It means walking into a court full of nobles, who will judge every word I say, and every stitch on my dress. It means someone finally sees you, Mira said, quieter now, her young face suddenly serious, in a way that caught Elira off guard. You've spent years taking care of me, working for Mistress Hale, never once doing anything just for yourself. Maybe it's time you let something good happen to you, even if it's terrifying. Elira stared at her sister, surprised by the wisdom behind such simple words, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly, some tight, protective instinct she had carried since their mother's passing, easing just enough to let a sliver of hope through. She turned back to the messenger. Tell him, she started, then paused, reconsidering. Actually, I'll write my answer myself, if you don't mind waiting a few minutes. The messenger nodded, and Elira sat at the small kitchen table, borrowing a scrap of parchment and ink from Mistress Hale's supplies she kept for occasional errands, and wrote her response carefully, crossing out words twice, before settling on something honest rather than polished. She told him she would come, not because he was a king, but because the stranger who carried an injured man and warned her to bolt her door had earned more trust than his title ever could have on its own. She told him Mira would need to be looked after properly while she was away, and that she expected honest answers once she arrived, about the danger surrounding him, about Baron Crane, about everything he had chosen not to say the first time they met. She sealed the letter and handed it to the waiting messenger, who bowed and mounted his horse immediately, riding back out through the gate before the sun had fully risen over the eastern hills. The following days passed in a blur of preparation and nervous anticipation. Mistress Hale, upon learning the reason Elira needed leave from her duties, seemed equal parts astonished and quietly proud, offering to look after Mira herself during the absence, a kindness Elira hadn't expected but accepted gratefully. Word spread through the village quickly, as it always did, and Elira found herself the subject of far more attention than she had ever wanted, curious glances following her through the market, whispered questions trailing in her wake wherever she walked. Petra, one of the few genuine friends Elira had kept close over the years, cornered her outside the bakery 2 days before her departure, eyes wide with barely contained excitement. Is it true you're going to the capital? To see him? It's true, Elira admitted, feeling heat rise in her cheeks despite herself. Elira Voss, summoned to the palace by the Alpha King himself. Petra shook her head in disbelief. A month ago, you were complaining about carrying market sacks in the rain. Now look at you. I'm terrified, Elira admitted quietly. I don't know the first thing about court, about how to speak to nobles, about any of it. What if I embarrass him? What if I embarrass myself? Petra took her hands, squeezing gently. You wiped mud on his cloak, and told him he'd never survive old Bram's fish stall, and he still sent for you. I don't think embarrassment is something you need to worry about with a man like that. Alira managed a shaky laugh despite her nerves, grateful for the reminder, even as the reality of what awaited her settled heavier with each passing hour. On the morning of her departure, a proper royal carriage arrived at the edge of the village, drawn by 2 matched gray horses, with an escort of 4 guards including, to Alira's mild relief, Garrick himself, who greeted her with a respectful nod that carried none of the suspicion she half expected from someone loyal enough to bow so deeply for his king. His Majesty asked me to personally see you safely to the capital, Garrick said, helping her into the carriage while a guard secured her small travel bag. He's been rather insistent about it, actually, more than I've seen him about most matters of state lately. Alira glanced at him, curious, despite her nerves. You've known him a long time? Since we were both young enough to still be foolish about it, Garrick said, a faint smile touching his weathered face. I've watched him carry more weight than most men could bear without complaint. Watched every noble in that court flatter him for their own gain, more times than I care to count. I haven't seen him speak about anyone the way he spoke about you, miss. Whatever happened between you and the mud on that cloak, it clearly meant more to him than either of you probably realized at the time. Alira said nothing, though the words settled warmly somewhere beneath her nervousness, and she watched through the carriage window as the familiar streets of Miller's Row gave way to the wider road leading south, Mira's small figure growing smaller and smaller behind them, waving until the carriage rounded a bend and the village disappeared from view entirely. The journey to the capital took the better part of 2 days, and Alira spent much of it staring out at unfamiliar countryside, her mind cycling endlessly between excitement and dread, rehearsing conversations she suspected would go nothing like she imagined, once she actually stood in front of him again. She thought of Baron Crane, whose name Garrick had mentioned more than once with careful, controlled tension in his voice, and wondered exactly what kind of danger she was riding directly into, however gilded the carriage carrying her there happened to be. By the time the capital's tall stone walls came into view on the horizon, gleaming faintly gold in the late afternoon light, Alira's heart pounded with a mixture of terror and anticipation, so tangled together, she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Whatever waited for her beyond those walls, she understood with sudden, absolute clarity that her ordinary life in Miller's Row had ended the moment she wiped mud on a stranger's cloak without looking up, and there would be no simple way to return to it now. Inside the palace, Cade had spent the better part of the morning distracted by a report he could not seem to focus on, his attention drifting again and again toward the window overlooking the front courtyard. Council business had consumed nearly every waking hour since his return, border reports arriving daily, with increasingly troubling detail, Crane's careful maneuvering continuing beneath a surface of perfect courtesy that fooled no one who paid close attention. Yet none of it fully occupied the space in his mind that a village girl with mud-stained boots had somehow claimed. Garrick's message that morning, confirming Alira had accepted the invitation and was already traveling south, had done nothing to ease his restlessness. If anything, it sharpened it, mixing anticipation with a new, unfamiliar worry. The capital was not the quiet safety of a rain-soaked village street. It was a place where every kindness carried calculation, where every alliance existed to be exploited, where a girl with no noble blood and no political protection could become a target simply by standing too close to a king, already surrounded by enemies, patient enough to wait for exactly the wrong moment. He had weighed that danger carefully before sending the letter, and still chosen to send it. He told himself it was because he needed honest counsel amid a court full of flattery, because Alira's plain, unguarded way of speaking had shown him more truth in a single evening than most of his advisors managed in a year. He suspected, though he was not yet ready to examine it too closely, that the reason ran deeper than simple usefulness. Baron Crane learned of the invitation within a day, as he learned of nearly everything that happened within the palace walls, and received the news with the same careful, unreadable expression he wore for most matters that displeased him. "A village girl," Crane said quietly to Ellery, turning the information over as though examining it for flaws. No family name of note, no political standing whatsoever. What could the king possibly want with someone like that, beyond simple distraction? "Perhaps distraction is precisely what he wants, my lord," Ellery offered carefully. Crane considered this, tapping one finger against the arm of his chair. Perhaps. Or perhaps our king has developed a weakness that could prove rather useful, should circumstances require it. His eyes narrowed slightly, calculation sharpening behind them. Keep watch on the girl once she arrives, Ellery. Quietly. I want to know everything about her, and I want to know it before anyone else in this court thinks to look. Ellery bowed and withdrew, leaving Crane alone, with thoughts that had already begun shifting from mild curiosity towards something far more deliberate, the careful, patient calculation of a man who had spent years learning exactly how to turn small vulnerabilities into significant leverage. By the time Elira's carriage finally rolled through the capital's outer gates, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the tall stone towers of the palace in shades of amber and rose that might have seemed beautiful under any other circumstances. Instead, Elira pressed her hand against the carriage window, staring up at the scale of the buildings around her, the sheer weight of stone and history pressing down on streets far wider and busier than anything Miller's Row had ever contained, and felt her earlier courage waver considerably. Garrick, riding close beside the carriage, seemed to sense her nervousness, even through the closed window, slowing his horse enough to speak through the small gap. "Nearly there, miss. His Majesty asked to be informed the moment you arrived. I suspect he'll meet you himself, rather than waiting for a formal audience." "That doesn't exactly help my nerves," Elira admitted, managing a weak smile despite the tightness in her chest. "For what it's worth," Garrick said, "I don't think you have anything to prove here. Whatever drew his attention that first night, it wasn't polish or noble breeding. Try to remember that, whatever happens once you're inside those walls." The carriage rolled to a stop in the palace's inner courtyard, and before the driver could even lower the step, the main doors opened, and Cade himself descended the wide stone stairs, dressed now in clothes that finally matched the title she had learned belonged to him, dark formal robes trimmed with silver thread, a simple circlet resting against his dark hair. He looked, in that moment, every bit the Alpha King the stories described, powerful and composed, and entirely unlike the quiet stranger who had wiped rain from his eyes outside a village tavern. Then he saw her face through the carriage window, and something in his expression softened immediately, the careful composure cracking just enough to reveal the same man who had told her it was only cloth, who had carried an injured stranger with his own 2 hands, who had waited for her outside a well, simply to make certain she reached home safely. He opened the carriage door himself, waving off the attending servant who moved to do it for him, and offered his hand to help her down the step. "You came," he said quietly, as though some part of him hadn't quite believed she would. "You asked," Elira said, taking his hand and stepping down into a courtyard far grander than anything she had ever stood in before, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something warmer that refused to be talked out of existence no matter how overwhelming the surroundings felt. "I told you I expected honest answers once I arrived. I intend to hold you to that." A faint, genuine smile touched his mouth, the tension of the past several days easing visibly from his shoulders, for the first time since his return to the capital. "Then let's begin," he said, "before Crane finds a reason to interrupt us." He did not yet tell her how closely the Baron had already begun watching, nor how quickly her arrival had shifted from simple invitation into something far more dangerous within the court's shifting alliances. That truth, like so many others between them, would have to wait for a moment, when the weight of it could be carried more gently than a courtyard full of curious eyes allowed. Glass shattered somewhere down the corridor, and Elira jerked awake in an unfamiliar bed, disoriented for one long moment, before remembering she was inside the palace, in a guest chamber finer than anything she had ever slept in before. She sat up quickly, listening, and heard raised voices beyond her door, sharp and urgent, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. She threw a robe over her sleeping clothes, and cracked the door open just enough to see a young servant girl rushing past, face pale with fright. "What's happening?" Elira asked, catching the girl's sleeve. "Someone tried to get into the eastern wing during the night," the girl said breathlessly. "One of the guards caught them near the king's private chambers. There's blood, miss, and no one saying whose." Elira's stomach dropped. She didn't stop to think before hurrying down the corridor herself, following the direction the frightened servant had come from, her bare feet cold against the stone floor. She found a cluster of guards gathered near a side hallway, tension thick in the air, and pushed through just enough to see Garrick standing at the center of it, blood staining the sleeve of his uniform, though he stood upright and alert despite the injury. "Garrick." Elira's voice came out sharper than she intended, fear cutting through it. "Are you hurt badly?" He glanced at her, surprised to see her there at all, then shook his head. "A shallow cut. Nothing serious. Someone attempted to enter the king's chambers through the servants' passage. I intercepted them before they got far, but they escaped through the lower gardens before we could secure the exit." "Where's Cade?" The question left her before she remembered to use his proper title, and a few of the nearby guards exchanged glances at the familiarity, though none of them commented. "Here," came his voice from behind her, and she turned to find him approaching quickly, still dressed from whatever late hour he had been awake working through, his expression tight with barely controlled anger. He looked her over quickly, as though checking for injury, before turning his attention fully to Garrick. "Report." Whoever it was, moved with purpose, Garrick said. "They knew exactly which passage led closest to your chambers. That's not common knowledge outside the household staff and the guard rotation." Cade's jaw tightened visibly. "You're suggesting someone inside the palace provided that information. I'm suggesting we can no longer rule it out, Your Majesty." The implications settled heavily over the small group, and Elira watched Cade's expression shift from anger into something colder, more calculating. The same careful mask she had glimpsed briefly during the council discussions Garrick had described to her during the journey south. This was not the quiet stranger from the rainy village street. This was a king, facing a threat inside his own walls, and the weight of that reality pressed visibly down on him. "Double the guard on every wing," Cade said. "I want every servant's passage checked and secured by morning. And I want to know exactly who had access to the guard rotation schedule this past week." Garrick nodded and moved to carry out the orders despite his injury, waving off Elira's concerned protest that he should see a healer first. Cade turned back to her once the corridor had mostly cleared, worry replacing anger in his expression now that the immediate crisis had passed. "You shouldn't be out here," he said quietly. "Not until we know exactly what happened tonight." "I heard shouting and glass breaking," Elira said. "I wasn't about to stay hidden behind a locked door while people I care about might be in danger." Something in his expression softened at that, despite the tension still gripping the rest of him. "People you care about," he repeated quietly, testing the words. Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she didn't take the words back. "Don't make this strange," she muttered. "I meant Garrick, and you, apparently, though I'm still deciding how I feel about that, given everything happening around here." A tired, genuine smile broke through his tension for just a moment. "Fair enough." He glanced down the now empty corridor, then back to her. "Come. You shouldn't be standing in a cold hallway in bare feet after everything that just happened. I'll have someone bring tea to the sitting room, and I'll tell you what I should have told you the very first night we met." She followed him through the quiet palace, past guards who bowed as they passed, and servants who cast curious glances her way, into a smaller, warmer sitting room, where a fire had already been lit against the night chill. Cade gestured for her to sit, then paced instead of joining her, restless energy clearly still coursing through him from the night's events. "Baron Crane wants my throne," he said finally, without preamble, deciding apparently that plain honesty suited the moment better than careful diplomacy. "He's wanted it for years, though he's been patient and careful enough that I've never had solid proof to move against him directly. The border unrest, the wolf attack near your village, tonight's intrusion, I believe all three are connected, pieces of a larger plan, meant to weaken my position enough that the council loses confidence in my ability to protect the realm." Elira absorbed this, her earlier fear settling into something steadier, more focused. "And if the council loses confidence? Then a vote could be called," Cade said grimly. "A vote to remove an alpha unfit to rule is rare, and has not succeeded in generations, but the mechanism exists, and Crane has spent years quietly building support for exactly that possibility, should he ever gather enough justification." "That's why you didn't tell anyone about the village," Elira said slowly, understanding dawning. "About us. You were protecting me from becoming part of whatever weapon he's building against you." "Partly," Cade admitted, "and partly because those few days felt like the only honest thing I'd had in years, and I wasn't ready to hand them over to court gossip and political calculation before I understood what they meant myself." Elira studied him for a long moment, the firelight softening the exhaustion visible on his face, and felt something in her chest ache with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel toward a king, toward anyone, so soon after her ordinary life had been upended so completely. "And do you understand now?" she asked quietly. "What it meant?" He crossed the room and sat beside her, closer than strict formality probably allowed, though neither of them seemed inclined to care about that just then. "I understand that in 5 years of ruling this realm, no one has looked at me the way you did outside that tavern," he said. Not with fear, not with flattery, just with mild irritation at a stranger blocking her path home. "I understand that I have thought about very little else since." Illyra's breath caught slightly at the honesty in his voice, and for a moment, the danger surrounding them both, Crane's ambition, the intruder still loose somewhere in the palace grounds, the border threat sharpening beyond the northern treaty lines, all of it faded into something distant and manageable compared to the quiet warmth building steadily between them in the firelit room. "This is complicated," she said finally, though there was little conviction left in the protest. "Extremely," Cade agreed, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "I'd understand if you wanted to return home, to Mira, to a life with considerably less danger attached to it." Illyra considered that seriously for a moment, weighing fear against the strange, undeniable pull she felt toward this man, who had proven, again and again since that first rainy night, that his character ran deeper than his title. "You've given me those tonight, I think. Dangerous as it clearly is, I'd like to stay long enough to see what happens next." Something in his expression eased fully then, relief and warmth mixing together as he reached over, hesitant at first, and took her hand in his. "Then we'll face whatever comes together," he said, "starting with finding out exactly who let an intruder into my private wing tonight, and exactly how deep Crane's reach has grown within my own household." Outside, somewhere beyond the palace's outer walls, Ellery moved quickly through the shadowed streets, toward Baron Crane's private residence, breathless from the narrow escape through the lower gardens, a folded scrap of parchment clutched tightly in his hand, detailing everything he had glimpsed of the king's private chamber layout before Garrick's unexpected intervention had forced his retreat. The night's failure would need to be reported carefully, and Crane's patience, however practiced, was not infinite when it came to setbacks this close to his long-awaited opportunity. Crane received him in the private study at the back of his residence, still dressed despite the late hour, a single lamp burning low on the desk between them. He listened without interruption as Ellery explained the failed attempt, the unexpected guard who had intercepted him near the servants' passage, the narrow escape through the lower gardens under cover of darkness. "You were seen," Crane said finally, his voice flat and cold. "Only briefly, my lord. I do not believe the guard recognized my face in the dark." "You do not believe?" Crane rose from his chair and walked slowly to the window, looking out over the sleeping city with an expression carved from stone. "Belief is not certainty, Ellery, and certainty is precisely what I require if this plan is to succeed, without unraveling around us both." He was quiet for a long moment, turning the failure over in his mind, searching for whatever advantage might still be salvaged from it. "Perhaps this works in our favor regardless. An intrusion into the king's private wing, so soon after his mysterious absence, and the border unrest that followed it, will only deepen the council's unease. Fear serves us as well as proof, sometimes better." "And the girl, my lord? Word is already spreading through the household staff that she spent the night in the sitting room with him, that he took her hand himself in front of witnesses." Something sharpened behind Crane's eyes. "Then perhaps it is time to stop watching quietly and start ensuring the entire court understands exactly what kind of weakness their king has developed. A village girl, no name, no standing, occupying his private attention, while assassins slip through his own halls undetected. That is not the image of a steady ruler, Ellery. That is the image of a man distracted, vulnerable, easily unsettled. I intend to make certain every elder in that council chamber sees it exactly that way." Back within the palace walls, morning arrived with the entire household still on edge, guards stationed at every entrance, servants moving through their duties with visible nervousness. Cade convened a small, urgent meeting with Garrick and two of his most trusted advisors, poring over the guard rotation schedules and household staff records, searching for any name that connected too closely to Crane's known associates. Illyra, unwilling to simply wait idle in her chamber while danger continued circling the palace, found her way to the meeting room's outer hall and waited until Cade emerged. exhaustion evident in the tightness around his eyes, despite the fire still present in his expression. "Any progress?" she asked. "3 names worth investigating further," Cade said. "Nothing conclusive yet. Whoever arranged last night's intrusion was careful enough not to leave an obvious trail." He rubbed a hand across his face, the weight of sleepless hours clearly pressing on him. "I'm sorry your first days here have been consumed by all of this. It's hardly the welcome I intended when I sent that letter." "I didn't come expecting comfort," Elira said. "You told me the truth last night, about Crane, about the danger surrounding you. I'd rather stand beside that truth than be shielded from it in some quiet corner of the palace, wondering what you weren't telling me." Something in his expression warmed despite the exhaustion, and he reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair back from her face, with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the tension gripping the rest of the household. "Statements like that make it very difficult for me to remember all the reasons I should be sending you home to safety, instead of keeping you here. Maybe stop trying to find reasons to send me away," Elira said, surprising herself with the boldness of it, though she didn't take the words back. "I told you last night I wanted to stay and see what happens next. I meant it." He studied her for a long moment, something decided and certain settling behind his storm-gray eyes, before he finally nodded, some of the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "Then stay," he said, "but stay close, and stay careful. Whatever Crane is planning next, I don't intend to let it touch you, even if it means keeping guards on you as closely as he keeps eyes on me." Neither of them yet knew how quickly Crane intended to turn the previous night's failure into a weapon of an entirely different kind, one built not from blades or shadowed passages, but from whispers and reputation, aimed as much at Elira as at the throne she had, without ever intending to, become quietly tangled up in defending. Later that afternoon, Garrick found Elira alone near the palace's inner garden, watching workers repair a section of fence that intruders had apparently used to slip past the outer wall unnoticed the night before. He approached quietly, his injured arm now properly bandaged, and stood beside her for a long moment before speaking. "He hasn't smiled this often in years," Garrick said, without preamble. "Not since before the weight of the crown settled fully onto him. I wanted you to know that, whatever chaos surrounds your arrival here." Elira glanced at him, surprised by the openness of the observation. "Even with everything happening? The intrusion? Crane? All of it?" "Especially with everything happening," Garrick said. "A king who smiles despite danger closing in around him is a king who has found something worth protecting beyond his own throne. I've followed him long enough to know the difference." He nodded toward the garden gate, where Cade himself now approached, having finished whatever urgent business had occupied the remainder of his morning. "Whatever Crane throws at the two of you next, I suspect it will take considerably more than whispers to undo what's already taken root here." Elira said nothing, though the words settled warmly in her chest, as Cade crossed the garden toward them, and for a brief, quiet moment, the danger pressing in from every side felt, if not entirely absent, at least survivable in the company of people determined to face it together. A folded paper landed on the breakfast table in front of Elira, before she had even finished her tea, dropped there by a servant girl who refused to meet her eyes before hurrying from the room. Elira frowned and unfolded it slowly, and felt her stomach drop as she read the crude, cruel words scrawled across the page. "Village rat. Gold digger. Leave before the court removes you itself." Her hands trembled slightly as she set the paper down, humiliation and anger warring inside her chest. She had known, in some distant way, that not everyone in the palace would welcome her arrival, but seeing the hatred written out so plainly, still struck harder than she expected. Lorna Vane found her there minutes later, sweeping into the breakfast room with the effortless grace of someone born into exactly the kind of nobility Elira had never possessed. Lorna was beautiful, in a sharp, calculated way, dark hair perfectly arranged, eyes cool and assessing as they landed on the folded note still sitting on the table. "Trouble already, I see," Lorna said, settling into a chair across from Elira without invitation. "The court can be rather unwelcoming to those who arrive without proper introduction. I did try to warn the king that bringing you here without preparation would invite exactly this sort of reaction." Elira studied her carefully, sensing immediately that Lorna's concern carried far more calculation than genuine sympathy. "I don't recall asking for your warnings." "No," Lorna agreed with a thin smile. You wouldn't have. But then, you've never had to navigate a court like this one, have you? I've known Cade since we were children. My family has served the Ashvale line for 3 generations. I understand things about this world that a village girl simply cannot, however charming he currently finds your rough honesty. The insult landed precisely where it was aimed, and Alira felt heat rise in her cheeks, despite her determination not to give Lorna the satisfaction of a visible reaction. If you have a point, Lady Vane, I'd appreciate you making it plainly instead of circling it. Lorna's smile sharpened. My point is simple. Whatever brief fascination you've sparked in him will fade once the realities of ruling reassert themselves. Once Crane's threat to the throne demands his full attention. Once he remembers that a king's choice of companion carries political weight you cannot possibly provide. I'd hate to see you humiliated further when that reality finally sets in. Alira held her gaze steadily, refusing to look away first. You seem very concerned about my humiliation, for someone who clearly hopes to cause more of it. Something flickered behind Lorna's cool composure, brief and sharp, before she smoothed it away and rose gracefully from her chair. Enjoy your breakfast, she said simply, and swept from the room with the same effortless elegance she had entered with, leaving Alira alone with cold tea and an even colder unease settling in her stomach. She found Cade later that morning, in the small study he used for private counsel business, and set the crumpled note down on his desk without preamble. He read it, and she watched his expression darken considerably, jaw tightening in a way that reminded her sharply of the anger he'd shown, following the intrusion into his private wing days before. Who left this? He asked, voice controlled but clearly furious beneath the surface. I don't know, Alira admitted. A servant delivered it and wouldn't meet my eyes, but I also had a rather pointed conversation with Lady Vane this morning, and I suspect whatever hostility exists toward me in this court didn't start with an anonymous note. Cade's expression shifted at the mention of Lorna's name, something complicated passing behind his eyes. Lorna and I grew up together, he said carefully. Our families expected, for a long time, that we might eventually marry. Nothing ever came of it beyond expectation, but she's never entirely let go of the idea, and Crane has certainly noticed her resentment could be useful to his own ambitions. So she's working with him, Alira said slowly, pieces clicking into place. I don't have proof of that, Cade admitted, but I wouldn't be surprised. Crane is skilled at finding exactly the right pressure points in people already inclined toward bitterness. He set the crumpled note aside, meeting Alira's eyes with an intensity that steadied some of her earlier unease. I'm sorry this is what your first days here have looked like. If I had known the court would turn this hostile this quickly, I would have... Would have what? Alira interrupted gently. Not invited me? I told you before, I didn't come here expecting comfort. I came because you asked for honesty, and because whatever this is between us felt worth more than staying safely hidden in Miller's Row, wondering what might have happened if I'd said yes. Something in his expression softened, despite the tension still gripping the room, and he reached across the desk, taking her hand in his, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply against the anger still simmering beneath his composed exterior. Then let me handle Crane and Lorna both, he said. You shouldn't have to fight this battle alone, especially not against enemies who've had years to sharpen their claws while you've had only days to learn this world exists at all. Alira squeezed his hand, grateful for the support, even as a stubborn part of her resisted the idea of simply standing aside while others fought battles on her behalf. I appreciate that, she said, but I'm not going to hide in a corner while people whisper about me behind closed doors. If this court wants to test whether I belong here, I'd rather face that directly than let you shield me from every uncomfortable conversation. He studied her for a long moment, something like admiration mixing with worry in his expression, before nodding slowly. Stubborn, he said, though there was clear fondness beneath the word. You knew that about me from the very first night, Alira said, a faint smile finally breaking through her earlier tension. I did wipe mud on your cloak without so much as an apology, if you recall. I recall it rather fondly, actually, Cade admitted, the ghost of a smile finally returning to his own face despite everything weighing on him. That evening, a formal dinner had been arranged, ostensibly to celebrate the Border Patrol's successful reinforcement of the northern crossing points, though Alira suspected, watching the careful arrangement of nobles and council members filing into the Grand Hall, that the true purpose ran considerably more political than celebratory. She wore a borrowed gown, dark blue with silver embroidery along the sleeves, feeling entirely out of place among guests who had spent their whole lives learning exactly how to move through rooms like this one. Baron Crane approached her early in the evening, before Cade had finished greeting the arriving council members, his expression a mask of polite warmth that didn't quite reach his calculating eyes. "Miss Voss," he said smoothly, "I've heard a great deal about you these past few days. The village girl who captured our king's attention so thoroughly he abandoned his throne to chase after her." "I don't recall him abandoning anything," Alira said evenly, refusing to let his condescension rattle her. "As I understand it, he was investigating a border threat that turned out to be entirely real." But investigating alone, without proper counsel from his own council," Crane said, tone still deceptively pleasant. "A rather reckless choice for a king facing active threats to his realm. Wouldn't you agree? Though I suppose a village accustomed to simpler concerns might not fully appreciate the weight of such decisions." "I think," Alira said carefully, "that a king who trusts his own instincts enough to investigate a threat personally, rather than waiting for council permission to act, sounds considerably more capable than one who spends his energy undermining that king's judgment at dinner parties instead." Something flickered dangerously behind Crane's polite mask, and for one tense moment, Alira wondered if she had pushed too far. But then he simply smiled, cold and thin, and inclined his head slightly. "Sharp tongue, for a village girl," he said. "I can see why he finds you entertaining. We'll see how long that entertainment lasts once real pressure settles onto this court." He turned and walked away without waiting for her response, leaving her standing alone with her pulse hammering, and a fresh, uncomfortable certainty settling into her chest that whatever quiet threat Crane represented, she had just made herself considerably more visible within it. Cade found her moments later, having watched the exchange from across the hall with visible concern, and guided her gently toward a quieter corner of the room. "What did he say to you?" "Nothing I couldn't handle," Alira said, though her voice carried more tension than she intended. "But I don't think he's planning to leave either of us alone anytime soon, Cade. I think tonight was just the beginning of whatever he's building toward." Across the hall, Baron Crane accepted a glass of wine from a passing servant and watched the king and the village girl together, with careful, patient attention, already turning tonight's brief exchange over in his mind, searching for exactly the right way to use her sharp tongue and her lack of noble standing against a throne he intended to claim before the season's end, whatever cost that ultimately required. Lorna joined him a few minutes later, having watched the same exchange from a slightly closer vantage point, her expression carefully composed, though something bitter simmered clearly behind her cool eyes. "She's more resilient than I expected," Lorna admitted quietly. "Most guests who receive that particular note from you fold considerably faster." "You sent the note," Crane said, not quite a question, though he kept his voice low enough that no passing guest might overhear. "I merely arranged for it to be delivered," Lorna said. "The words were entirely my own, though I imagine you'd have chosen similar ones yourself." She glanced toward Alira and Cade, still speaking quietly in their corner of the hall, and something raw flickered across her expression before she smoothed it away again. "I don't understand what he sees in her. She has no training, no lineage, no understanding of anything this court requires." "Perhaps that's precisely what he sees in her," Crane said thoughtfully. "Something unspoiled by everything the rest of us have spent our lives calculating." He took a slow sip of wine, considering the puzzle from a new angle. "But unspoiled things break easily, Lady Vane, when enough pressure finds the right point to apply it. I don't intend to rely on notes and whispers alone much longer. If the girl proves as stubborn as tonight suggests, we may need to find leverage considerably more direct than court gossip." Lorna's eyes sharpened with interest, despite the discomfort still visible beneath her composure. "What kind of leverage did you have in mind?" "Patience," Crane said simply. "The border unrest has not resolved itself, whatever reinforcement the king's guards managed at the crossing points. If threats along that border continue, and if word reaches the council that his attention remains divided by matters of the heart rather than matters of state, the pressure will build itself, without requiring much additional effort from either of us. I intend to simply ensure that pressure finds its way to the right ears, at exactly the right moment." Meanwhile, in their quiet corner of the hall, Cade watched Alira's tension slowly ease as the evening wore on, though he remained acutely aware of every glance thrown their way, every whispered conversation that paused suspiciously when they drew close. He guided her toward the balcony eventually, away from the crowd's watchful eyes, the cool night air, a welcome relief after the charged atmosphere inside. "I owe you an apology," he said, once they stood alone beneath the stars, the sounds of the dinner party muffled behind them. "I underestimated how quickly this court would turn its full attention toward you. I should have prepared you better, warned you more clearly about people like Crane and Lorna, before throwing you directly into a room full of them." "I don't need to be shielded from difficult people," Alira said, though she leaned slightly into his side, grateful for the quiet solidity of his presence after the evening's tension. "I need you to trust that I can handle myself, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's frightening." "I do trust that," Cade said quietly. "It doesn't mean I enjoy watching you face it without being able to simply make the danger disappear." Alira turned to look at him fully, the moonlight softening the hard angles of worry still visible on his face. "For what it's worth," she said, "facing Crane's condescension tonight was considerably less frightening than the moment I realized who you actually were, standing there in that crowd with Garrick bowing at your feet. I've survived worse shocks than one Baron's cold stare." A tired laugh escaped him despite everything, genuine warmth breaking through the tension for the first time since dinner began. "I suppose that's a fair point," he admitted, "though I'd still prefer you didn't have to survive either kind of shock on my account." "Too late for that," Alira said softly, and found herself leaning closer without entirely deciding to, drawn by something steady and certain that had been building between them since that first rainy night outside the tavern. Cade didn't pull away. Instead, he reached up, gently brushing his fingers along her jaw, tilting her face slightly toward his own, and for a long, suspended moment, the danger surrounding them both, Crane's calculating ambition, Lorna's bitter resentment, the border threat still simmering beyond the treaty lines, all of it faded into something distant and unimportant compared to the quiet certainty passing between them beneath the stars. He didn't close the distance fully, some careful restraint holding him back even now, though his eyes searched hers as though asking permission he wasn't quite ready to voice aloud. "Elira," he said quietly, her name carrying weight she hadn't heard in it before. "I know," she whispered, understanding exactly what he wasn't saying, the impossible complications a single choice might unleash, across a court already primed to use her against him. "I know exactly how complicated this is." "And yet," he murmured, close enough now that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. "And yet," she echoed, and closed the last small distance between them herself, deciding in that quiet moment beneath the stars that whatever danger Crane and Lorna intended to build against them, she would rather face it standing beside him than retreat safely back to Miller's Row, wondering forever what might have happened if fear had won out over honesty. Behind them, unseen in the shadows near the balcony doors, a servant loyal to Baron Crane watched the entire exchange unfold and slipped quietly back inside to deliver the news that would, within hours, become the sharpest weapon Crane had yet found against a king, determined to protect the one honest thing he had found in years of careful, exhausting rule. Council chamber doors slammed open before Cade had even finished his morning meal, and Garrick strode in without waiting for permission, his expression grim enough that Cade rose immediately from his chair, appetite forgotten. "Crane has called an emergency session," Garrick said. "Full council, all elders present. He's demanding it happen within the hour." "On what grounds?" Cade asked, already moving toward the door. "Conduct unbecoming a ruler," Garrick said grimly. "He's using last night, Your Majesty. Someone saw you on the balcony with Miss Voss and reported it directly to him. He's framing it as evidence that your judgment has become compromised, that a king, distracted by personal attachment while active threats remain unresolved along the border, cannot be trusted to rule with a clear mind." Cade's jaw tightened, fury flashing hot and immediate, before he forced it down beneath the calm, controlled expression a king needed to wear into a hostile council chamber. "He's moving faster than I expected." "He's moving because he sensed weakness and intends to strike before it has time to strengthen," Garrick said. "You need to decide now how you intend to handle this, because the elders are already gathering, and Crane has had all night to prepare his argument, while you were occupied elsewhere." Cade found Alira in the corridor moments later, having heard the commotion, and hurried from her chamber, still fastening the last clasp of her dress. Her face paled as he explained the situation quickly. the weight of what her presence had already cost him settling heavily onto her shoulders. "This is my fault," she said. "If I hadn't come here, if I hadn't—" "Don't," Cade said firmly, taking her hands in his despite the urgency pressing against them both. "This is Crane's doing, not yours. He would have found another angle eventually, another weakness to exploit. You are not the cause of this. You are simply the excuse he's chosen to use. That distinction won't matter much to a council chamber full of elders, deciding whether you're fit to rule," Illyra said, fear sharpening her voice. "No," Cade admitted. "It won't, which is why I need you to trust me now, more than you have at any point since that first rainy night. Whatever happens in that chamber, I will not let Crane use you as the reason my throne falls. I would rather step back myself than let that happen." The words struck her hard, and she stared at him, understanding the enormity of what he'd just said, the willingness to sacrifice everything he had built and protected for years, rather than let her become collateral damage in Crane's ambitious game. "Cade, you cannot mean that. This throne is everything you've worked for. I won't let you throw it away because of me. It's not for you to allow, or prevent," Cade said gently, though there was steel beneath the softness. "It's my choice to make, and I've made it. Now I need to face that chamber, and I need you to trust that I know how to fight this particular battle." He pressed a brief, firm kiss to her forehead, something almost desperate in the gesture, before straightening and turning toward the council chamber with Garrick falling into step beside him. Illyra watched him go, her heart pounding with fear, and something fiercer, something that refused to simply stand by, while the man she had grown to care for walked into a fight, partly created by her own presence in his life. She made a decision then, quick and certain, and followed at a careful distance, slipping into the council chamber's outer gallery, where a handful of lesser nobles and observers were permitted to watch proceedings from a respectful remove. Inside, the full council had assembled, elders seated in a wide half-circle facing the raised dais where Cade now stood, Crane positioned prominently near the front, his expression carefully arranged into solemn concern rather than open triumph. "Your Majesty," Crane began, once the chamber had settled into tense silence, "I bring this matter forward with genuine reluctance, but the realm's stability demands it be addressed plainly. Reports have reached me, credible and multiple, suggesting your attention these past weeks has been substantially occupied by personal matters, rather than the pressing threats facing our border. An unexplained absence during active unrest, an intrusion into your own private chambers that remains unresolved. And now, a public display of affection toward a woman with no standing, no lineage, and no place within the responsibilities a king's companion would be expected to bear." Murmurs rippled through the gathered elders, some sympathetic to Crane's framing, others clearly uncomfortable with the directness of the accusation. Cade let the silence stretch a moment before responding, his voice calm, measured, carrying the same steady authority Illyra remembered from their very first conversation outside the tavern. "Let me address each concern plainly, since Baron Crane has chosen to raise them so publicly," Cade said. "My absence was spent investigating a genuine threat along our northern border, a threat that proved entirely real, as the wolf attack near Miller's Row and the tracks discovered at the crossing point can attest. I did not vanish carelessly. I acted on direct suspicion, and that suspicion was correct." He paused, letting that land before continuing. "The intrusion into my private chambers remains under active investigation, and I would remind this council that an unresolved threat inside our own walls is precisely the kind of danger that demands vigilance, not distraction, with unrelated personal matters. As for the woman Baron Crane refers to so dismissively, her name is Illyra Voss, and she has shown more honesty and courage in the weeks I've known her than most of this chamber has offered me in years of careful, calculated flattery." Crane's composure flickered, just slightly, at the directness of the challenge. "With respect, Your Majesty, honesty and courage are admirable qualities, but they do not substitute for the political understanding required of someone standing beside a ruler. This council has a responsibility to consider whether personal attachment has clouded judgment that the realm depends upon remaining clear. And I would remind this council," Cade said, voice hardening, "that Baron Crane has spent considerably more energy these past weeks building a case against my judgment than he has spent addressing the actual threat along our border. I find it curious, Baron, that your concern for the realm's stability seems to align so precisely with opportunities to question my fitness to rule." The chamber erupted into low, urgent murmuring, several elders exchanging pointed glances at the implication, hanging openly in the air now. Crane's jaw tightened, the first genuine crack appearing in his careful composure. "Are you accusing me of something, Your Majesty?" "I am observing a pattern," Cade said evenly. "One I intend to examine considerably more closely in the coming days. But today, this council was called to question my judgment, based on personal attachment, and I have answered that question plainly. I trust Elira Voss. I trust her honesty more than I trust the flattery this chamber has offered me for years, and I do not intend to abandon that trust, because it makes certain ambitious members of this council uncomfortable." An elder near the front, an older woman named Vessa who had served the council longer than most others combined, rose slowly to her feet. "Your Majesty's border investigation proved sound judgment, not reckless distraction," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I move that this session end without further action against the Crown, and that Baron Crane's concerns be noted for future discussion, rather than treated as grounds for any formal measure today." Several other elders murmured agreement, and Elira, watching from the gallery with her heart in her throat, felt a fragile wave of relief wash through her as the chamber's tension began, slowly, to shift back in Cade's favor. Crane said nothing further, his expression settling back into careful neutrality, though the cold calculation behind his eyes suggested this defeat, however small, had only sharpened his resolve rather than dampened it. The session dissolved shortly after, elders filing out in low, urgent conversation, and Cade found Elira waiting near the gallery entrance the moment he emerged, exhaustion and relief mixing plainly across his face. "You were magnificent in there," Elira said, unable to stop herself from reaching for his hand, despite the watchful eyes still lingering in the corridor. "I meant every word," Cade said quietly. "But this isn't finished, Elira. Crane retreated today, but a man like that doesn't simply accept defeat. He'll return with something sharper, something harder to counter with words alone." Elira nodded, the fragile relief of the moment already tempered by the certainty of what still lay ahead. "Then we'll be ready for it," she said, "together, like you said last night." Cade squeezed her hand, something fierce and protective settling into his expression as they walked together back toward the private wing, both of them fully aware that whatever quiet victory today's council session had won, Baron Crane's next move was already taking shape somewhere in the shadows of the capital, patient and calculating as ever. That evening, Elder Vessa requested a private audience with Elira, an unusual gesture that left Elira nervous as she made her way to the small chamber the older woman used for quiet reading and correspondence. Vessa greeted her warmly enough, gesturing to a chair near the window, and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I've served on this council through 3 different reigns," Vessa said. "I've watched countless nobles parade through these halls, each one polished, each one saying precisely what they believed the crown wanted to hear. I supported you today, Miss Voss, not because I know you well, but because I recognized something in the way you sat in that gallery, hands clenched, jaw tight, ready to march into that chamber yourself despite the danger, had things gone differently." "I nearly did," Elira admitted. "I'm not sure what I would have said if it had come to that. Probably something honest and entirely improper for a council chamber," Vessa said, a dry smile touching her weathered face. "Which is precisely why I suspect our king finds you so compelling. This court has surrounded him with careful words and careful smiles for years. You offer him neither, and I think, whether he fully realizes it yet, that honesty may prove more valuable to his reign than any amount of noble breeding ever could." "Baron Crane doesn't see it that way," Elira said. "Baron Crane sees only opportunity and obstacle," Vessa said, her expression sharpening. "He has wanted this throne since before you were likely born, Miss Voss. Today's session was merely his opening move. I would advise you both to remain watchful, particularly regarding anyone within the household staff who might have divided loyalties. Crane has a talent for finding exactly the right pressure point in exactly the right person." Elira left the meeting with Vessa's warning settling heavily alongside the day's exhaustion, and found Cade waiting for her in the private sitting room, where their honest conversation days before had first begun to change everything between them. He looked up as she entered, some of the day's tension easing at the sight of her. "Vessa spoke with you," he said, not quite a question. "She warned me about divided loyalties within the household," Elira said, settling beside him. "She thinks Crane's opening move today was just the beginning of something considerably more calculated. "She's not wrong," Cade said grimly. "I've already asked Garrick to quietly review every servant assigned near our private wings, cross-referencing against anyone with known ties to Crane's household or allies. It will take time, but I intend to close whatever gaps he's been using against us." Elira leaned into his side, weariness finally catching up with the adrenaline of the day's confrontation. "Do you ever wonder," she said quietly, "what your life would look like if I'd simply looked up that first night, apologized properly, and walked away without any of this happening?" Cade considered the question seriously, his arms settling around her shoulders. "Quieter," he admitted. "Lonelier, certainly. I don't regret a single moment of the chaos you've brought into my life, Elira, however dangerous Crane intends to make it. I'd rather face every bit of this with you beside me than return to the careful, hollow existence I had before that rainy night outside the tavern." She smiled despite the exhaustion, despite the danger still coiling somewhere in the capital's shadows, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to simply rest against him, drawing strength from the steady warmth of his presence, before whatever Crane's next calculated move turned out to be arrived to test them both once again. Elsewhere in the capital, Baron Crane sat alone in his study long after Ellery had retired for the night, a single candle burning low as he reviewed the day's failure with the same careful precision he applied to every setback. Vessa's intervention had cost him more than he wanted to admit, swinging enough of the older, more cautious elders back toward the king's side to blunt his opening move considerably. But he had expected resistance. He had planned for it. He unlocked a small drawer in his desk and withdrew a folded map of the northern border, the same crossing point Garrick had investigated days before, marked now with additional notes in Crane's own careful hand. If honest argument inside the council chamber would not be enough to shake the throne loose, then perhaps a genuine crisis, engineered carefully enough to appear entirely natural, would accomplish what words alone could not. He had allies beyond the treaty line, contacts cultivated over years of patient, careful correspondence, individuals who owed him considerably more than simple loyalty could explain. A larger incident along the border, timed precisely to coincide with renewed doubt about the king's divided attention, would leave the council with little choice but to question, once again, whether Cade Ashvale possessed the clarity of mind required to protect the realm from a threat sharpening steadily beyond its northern edge. Crane folded the map carefully and returned it to its drawer, already composing in his mind the careful, deniable instructions he intended to send north before dawn. Today's chamber had ended in his opponent's favor. He did not intend to let tomorrow's crisis end the same way. A rider collapsed at the palace gates just past midnight, blood soaking through his uniform, barely conscious enough to gasp out a single warning before the guards carried him inside. The northern crossing has fallen. Cade was pulled from sleep by Garrick's urgent knocking, and within minutes, the entire palace had erupted into controlled chaos, guards mobilizing, messengers dispatched, the weight of genuine crisis settling over the capital like a physical force. Elira found Cade in the war room barely 20 minutes later, maps spread across the wide table, Garrick and two senior commanders already deep in tense discussion beside him. His face was pale, jaw set with a hardness she hadn't seen since the council chamber days before. "How bad?" she asked, slipping into the room despite the guard's initial hesitation to let her pass. "Bad enough," Cade said grimly, not looking up from the map. "A coordinated strike against the northern crossing, larger than anything we've faced in years. Whoever organized this knew exactly where our defenses were thinnest, knew exactly when to move." His eyes finally lifted to meet hers, something cold and certain settling behind them. "This wasn't opportunistic aggression, Elira. This was planned, and planned by someone with detailed knowledge of our border patrols." "Crane," Elira said, the name landing heavy in the tense room. "I have no proof yet," Cade said, "but the timing is impossible to ignore. Days after his council challenge fails, our northern crossing falls to an attack precise enough to suggest inside knowledge." He turned back to the map, tracing the borderline with a tense finger. "I need to ride north myself, immediately. This crisis demands the Crown's presence, not delegated command through messengers." "Then I'm coming with you," Elira said immediately. "Absolutely not." Cade's voice carried a sharpness she rarely heard from him, worry, rather than anger, driving the refusal. "This is an active battlefield, Elira. I cannot protect you and command a defense simultaneously." I'm not asking you to protect me, Illyra said, matching his intensity without backing down. I'm telling you I won't sit safely in this palace while you ride into danger, especially knowing Crane may have people watching every move made here in your absence. If something happens to you out there, I don't intend to be trapped inside these walls, helpless and useless, waiting for news. Garrick, watching the exchange with careful attention, cleared his throat. Your Majesty, if I may. Keeping her here alone carries its own risk, particularly given what happened with the intrusion into your private wing. Crane's reach inside this palace remains uncertain. Perhaps a compromise, closer to the northern encampment but away from the actual front lines, would satisfy both concerns. Cade considered this for a long, tense moment, torn between the fierce protectiveness driving his refusal and the practical truth of Garrick's observation. Finally, he exhaled, some of the tension easing from his shoulders as he accepted the compromise, however reluctantly. The border town of Ashfall Hollow then, close enough to receive reports quickly, far enough from the front to remain reasonably safe. You'll travel under heavy guard, and you will not, under any circumstances, cross closer to the actual fighting. Agreed, Illyra said, relief and determination mixing together as the plan solidified. They departed within the hour, a hastily assembled column of guards and supply wagons moving north through the pre-dawn darkness, the weight of the unfolding crisis pressing down on every rider in the group. Illyra rode close beside Cade for much of the journey, watching the careful, controlled tension radiating off him as reports arrived periodically from scouts riding ahead, each one carrying fragments of increasingly troubling news. The crossing garrison held longer than expected, one exhausted scout reported, intercepting the column just past midday. But they're outnumbered and low on supplies. Whoever's leading the attacking force knows our defensive patterns intimately. They've avoided every ambush point our patrols usually rely on. Cade's expression darkened further with each report, and Illyra could see the toll it was taking on him, not just the strategic worry, but something more personal, the growing certainty that someone within his own trusted circle had betrayed the realm's defenses to make this attack possible. They reached Ashfall Hollow by evening, a modest border town transformed into a bustling military staging point, soldiers and supply wagons filling streets that would normally have stood quiet at this hour. Cade established a command post in the town's largest building, a converted meeting hall, and immediately began coordinating with the commanders already gathered there, poring over updated maps and casualty reports with grim, focused intensity. Illyra found herself largely sidelined during those first frantic hours, though she refused to simply retreat to whatever quiet room had been arranged for her. Instead, she made her way to the makeshift healing station, established near the town's edge, where wounded soldiers from the crossing garrison had begun arriving in a steady, grim stream. She had no formal training, but years of helping Mistress Hale and caring for Mira had taught her enough about tending wounds and offering comfort that the overwhelmed healers welcomed her assistance without question. She spent hours there, cleaning wounds, holding trembling hands, offering water and quiet reassurance to soldiers far from home and frightened despite their training. It was grueling, exhausting work, and by the time Cade finally found her there past midnight, her hands were stained and her dress splattered with blood that wasn't her own. Exhaustion etched deeply into every line of her posture. "You should be resting," he said quietly, though there was no real reproach in his voice, only tired concern as he took in the scene around her. "So should you," Illyra said, managing a weak smile despite her exhaustion. "How bad is it?" "We've stabilized the immediate line," Cade said, sitting heavily beside her on the low bench she occupied. "But we lost ground, and we lost good soldiers doing it. I've sent word for reinforcements from the eastern garrison, but it will take days to arrive." He rubbed a hand across his tired face, the weight of command visible in every exhausted line of his expression. "I keep thinking about what Garrick said, about someone within my own circle sharing information that made this attack possible. I don't want to believe it, but the evidence keeps pointing that direction." "Whoever it is," Illyra said, "they'll be found eventually. People like Crane, people willing to sacrifice soldiers' lives for political advantage. They always slip eventually. Their patience runs out before their ambition does." Cade looked at her for a long moment, something tender breaking through the exhaustion and worry. "How is it that after a day like this, watching soldiers bleed and die because of decisions made in shadowed palace studies, you still manage to say something that makes me feel steadier?" "Practice," Illyra said softly. I've spent years finding steady things to say when Mira was frightened, when our situation felt impossible. I suppose the habit doesn't disappear just because the stakes got considerably larger. He reached over, taking her blood-stained hand gently in his own, unbothered by the mess of the day's work still clinging to her skin. Whatever happens in the coming days, he said quietly, I need you to know that having you here, even against every instinct telling me to keep you safely locked away in the capital, has made this crisis bearable in a way I didn't expect. Elira squeezed his hand, drawing what comfort she could from the quiet moment amid the chaos surrounding them both. We'll get through this, she said, with more certainty than she entirely felt. Together, remember? Together, Kate agreed, and for a brief, fragile moment, exhaustion and danger faded just enough to let something steady and certain pass between them. A promise neither of them fully understood yet, how difficult it might become to keep, as reports continued arriving through the night, detailing an enemy force that seemed, disturbingly, to always know exactly where the border's defenses ran thinnest. Garrick entered the command post shortly after, exhaustion carved into his weathered face, though his eyes carried a sharp, urgent alertness that cut through the late hours' fatigue. Your Majesty, we captured one of the attacking scouts alive near the eastern ridge. He's refusing to speak, but the markings on his gear are unlike anything native to the tribes beyond the treaty line. I believe he may be a mercenary, not a soldier loyal to any border faction. Cade rose immediately, the weariness in his posture hardening into focused determination. A mercenary suggests someone hired this attack rather than provoked it through genuine border grievance. That was my thought as well, Garrick said grimly. Someone with considerable resources and a reason to want this crossing destabilized specifically now, while council attention remains divided by recent events in the capital. Elira felt a cold certainty settle over her as the pieces continued aligning exactly where she feared they would. Crane, she said quietly. I intend to find out for certain, Cade said, already moving toward the door, purpose replacing exhaustion in every line of his body. Garrick, bring the prisoner to me directly. If there's a connection to trace back to the capital, I want it found before this crisis claims another single soldier's life. He paused at the doorway, glancing back at Elira with a mixture of reluctance and resolve. Stay here, please. Rest if you can. I'll send word the moment I learn anything useful. Elira nodded, though sleep felt impossibly distant, with soldiers still arriving wounded from the front, and the weight of Crane's likely betrayal settling heavier with every passing hour. She remained at the healing station a while longer, tending to those who needed it, her mind working steadily through everything she had witnessed since that first rainy night outside the tavern, marveling grimly at how quickly an ordinary life could transform into something this dangerous, this consequential, all because a stranger's cloak had happened to catch the mud from her boots. By the time exhaustion finally forced her toward the small room arranged for her rest, the eastern sky had begun lightening toward dawn, and somewhere beyond the command post's walls, Cade remained locked in urgent interrogation with a captured mercenary, whose answers, whatever they turned out to be, seemed certain to reshape the fragile balance of trust and betrayal, already straining the realm to its breaking point. The interrogation itself yielded little at first. The mercenary, a hardened man with cold, guarded eyes, refused every question with practiced silence, clearly experienced enough in his trade to understand exactly what information was worth protecting even under pressure. Cade paced the small room where the man had been secured, patience wearing thinner with every passing minute, as reports of continued fighting along the crossing filtered in from outside. You understand your position, Cade said finally, stopping directly in front of the prisoner. Whoever hired you clearly did not plan for your capture. That means you are, at this moment, entirely expendable to them. I can offer you something they cannot, a chance to walk away from this alive, if the information you provide proves useful enough to matter. The mercenary studied him for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his guarded expression. Promises from a king mean little to men like me, he said finally, voice rough with exhaustion and old scars. But dying for a paymaster who'll deny ever knowing my name means considerably less. Then talk, Cade said. I don't know who arranged the contract directly, the man admitted. Payment came through an intermediary. Coin and instructions delivered without a face attached to either. But the instructions were specific. Strike the crossing hard enough to draw the king north personally, and hold the line long enough to keep him occupied here for at least a fortnight. Cade's expression darkened considerably. Occupied here, not simply weakened at the border. Those were the words used, Your Majesty. Occupied, distracted. Someone wanted you away from your capital for a specific stretch of time, though I couldn't say why. Garrick, standing near the doorway, exchanged a grim look with Cade as the implication settled over the room. If this was never truly about weakening the border, Garrick said slowly, but about clearing you from the capital for a fixed period, then whatever Crane actually intends may be unfolding back home, right now, while we remain occupied here exactly as planned. Cade's fists clenched at his sides, fury and dawning horror mixing together as the true shape of Crane's strategy finally became clear. The Council, he said. If I'm absent long enough, with a genuine crisis to justify it, Crane could push through whatever measure he's been building toward, without my presence to counter him directly. A vote of no confidence, Garrick said grimly, or worse, a formal challenge to the succession itself, argued in your absence, while the border crisis provides perfect justification for questioning your capacity to rule. Cade turned sharply toward the door, urgency replacing exhaustion entirely in his bearing. We cannot stay occupied here as planned. I need reinforcements moved into position immediately, and I need to return to the capital before Crane finishes whatever he's building in my absence. Your Majesty, the crossing still requires steady command, Garrick warned. Leaving now, with the line only just stabilized, risks losing everything we've fought to hold these past hours. Cade paused, torn between two crises that both demanded his immediate presence, the weight of an impossible choice settling heavily onto his shoulders. He thought of Alira, exhausted and asleep somewhere in this border town after hours spent tending wounded soldiers with nothing but her own steady courage to guide her. He thought of the capital, of Crane's patient calculation finally reaching its intended conclusion, while the throne itself sat vulnerable and undefended. Whatever decision he made in the next few hours would determine considerably more than the outcome of a single battle, and he understood, with grim clarity, that Crane had planned this entire crisis specifically to force him into exactly this impossible position. Smoke rose over the capital's eastern district before Cade's returning column had even reached the outer gates, and Alira felt dread coil tight in her stomach as their exhausted horses thundered the final stretch toward home. Cade had split his forces carefully before leaving Ashfall Hollow, leaving enough soldiers under a trusted commander's control to hold the crossing, while he raced south with a smaller, faster group, Alira insisting fiercely that she ride with him, rather than remain behind in a border town that no longer felt safer than the danger awaiting them in the capital. They reached the palace gates to find chaos already unfolding, guards positioned tensely along the walls, servants hurrying between buildings with fearful, hushed urgency. Garrick, riding just behind Cade, cursed under his breath at the sight. Something has already happened here. They found Vessa waiting near the main entrance, her usual composed dignity replaced by visible relief the moment she spotted Cade dismounting. "Thank the moon you've returned," she said quickly. "Baron Crane called an emergency session 2 days ago, claiming your continued absence during active crisis proved conclusively that the throne required immediate, temporary transfer of authority. He very nearly succeeded in pushing a formal vote through the council." "Nearly," Cade repeated sharply. "What stopped him?" "I did, along with several elders still loyal enough to demand proper procedure rather than rushed panic," Vessa said. "But Your Majesty, he did not stop there. When his formal challenge stalled, he moved differently. There was an incident within the palace itself last night. An attempt, we believe, to seize control of the treasury and armory by force, using guards loyal to his own household rather than the crown." Alira's blood ran cold. "Was anyone hurt?" "Several guards, defending their posts," Vessa said grimly. "The attempt failed, ultimately, but only because loyal forces held the armory long enough for reinforcement. Baron Crane has retreated to his estate within the city, claiming innocence, insisting the guards who attempted the seizure acted without his knowledge or authorization." Cade's expression turned to stone, fury and betrayal hardening into something colder, more dangerous than Alira had ever witnessed from him before. He moved against the crown directly. That is no longer political maneuvering within acceptable bounds. That is treason. "The council is divided on how to proceed," Vessa admitted. "Some believe swift, decisive action is required immediately. Others fear moving against a baron, with as much influence as Crane possesses, might fracture the court entirely, especially with the border crisis still unresolved. The border crisis was engineered specifically to create this opportunity, Cade said, his voice carrying a hard, controlled fury that silenced everyone nearby. I have testimony from a captured mercenary, confirming as much. Crane orchestrated an attack against our own soldiers, cost real lives at that crossing, purely to clear a path for exactly the kind of seizure attempted here last night. He turned toward Garrick. Gather every guard still loyal to the crown. I want Crane's estate surrounded within the hour, and I want him brought before this council to answer for treason, openly, with evidence presented for every elder to witness directly. Garrick nodded sharply and moved to carry out the order immediately, and Alira felt the full weight of the moment settle over her, understanding that whatever confrontation lay ahead would determine not just the fate of Cade's throne, but potentially the safety of everyone connected to it, herself included. I'm coming with you, she said, before Cade could suggest otherwise. Alira. No, she said firmly, meeting his eyes without flinching. I've spent this entire journey watching you fight this battle from every angle. The council chamber, the border crisis, and now this. I am not going to hide in a palace room while the final confrontation happens somewhere I can't see it. If Crane intends to use me as a weapon against you, I'd rather stand where he can see that weapon refuses to be used that way. Something in Cade's expression shifted, exhausted fury softening into fierce, reluctant pride, and he nodded once, accepting her resolve rather than fighting it further. Stay close to Garrick, he said. Whatever happens, I need you safe. They rode together toward Crane's estate within the hour, a substantial force of loyal guards moving through the capital's streets with grim, purposeful speed, drawing crowds of curious, worried citizens who sensed, correctly, that something significant was unfolding. Crane's estate came into view eventually. Tall iron gates already closed against the approaching force, guards visible along the walls, though notably fewer than Alira expected given the scale of ambition Crane had displayed thus far. Cade rode to the front of the assembled force and called out, his voice carrying clearly across the tense space between them. Baron Crane, you stand accused of treason against the crown, of orchestrating an attack against our own border defenses, and of attempting armed seizure of the royal armory. Surrender yourself now, and this council will grant you a fair hearing before judgment. Continue to resist, and you leave me no choice but to treat this as open rebellion. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened, the estate's gates remaining firmly shut, guards along the walls shifting nervously, but making no move either to attack or surrender. Then, finally, the gates creaked open, and Baron Crane himself emerged, dressed impeccably, despite the circumstances, his expression a careful mask of wounded dignity, rather than open guilt. Your Majesty, he said, voice carrying easily across the courtyard, I fear you've been badly misinformed. Whatever occurred at the armory last night happened entirely without my knowledge or sanction. I am as horrified by such lawless action as you are. A captured mercenary has already confirmed the border attack was arranged through intermediaries, connected to your household, Cade said flatly, dismounting to stand directly before him, refusing to let the accusation remain distant or abstract. And the guards who attempted last night's seizure wore your household's colors beneath their uniforms, colors your own steward, failed to remove quickly enough before witnesses noticed. Crane's composure flickered, just slightly, the first genuine crack Alira had witnessed in his carefully maintained facade since arriving in the capital. Circumstantial claims, Your Majesty, easily manufactured by anyone wishing to see my family's long service to this crown, ended through false accusation. Then you'll have every opportunity to argue that before the full council, Cade said. But you will do so as a prisoner awaiting judgment, not as a free baron, continuing to plot from the comfort of his own estate. He gestured, and Garrick moved forward with several guards to formally take Crane into custody, the baron's composure finally shattering entirely, as the reality of his failed ambition settled fully upon him. You'll regret this, Crane hissed, all pretense of wounded innocence abandoned now. This realm deserves stronger leadership than a king, distracted by village girls and sentimental honesty. I merely tried to give it what it actually needs. This realm deserves a ruler who doesn't sacrifice soldiers' lives and threaten armed rebellion purely to satisfy his own ambition, Cade said coldly. Whatever you believed you were offering, Baron, it was never strength. It was only greed wearing strength's mask. As the guards led Crane away, Elira felt the tension of the past several days finally begin to release from her shoulders, though the exhaustion of everything they had endured together settled heavily in its place. Cade turned to her, something raw and grateful passing across his tired features, and crossed the courtyard to pull her into a tight, relieved embrace, uncaring of the watching guards and curious crowd gathered beyond the estate's gates. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "Not quite," Elira said softly, though she allowed herself to lean into the embrace fully, drawing comfort from his steady warmth after days of danger and uncertainty. "There's still a formal judgment to come, still a council to convince fully, still Lorna's role in all of this to untangle. But for tonight, I think we've earned a single quiet moment before facing whatever comes next." Cade pulled back just enough to look at her properly, exhaustion and relief and something deeper, steadier, warming his storm-gray eyes. "A single quiet moment," he agreed. "Sounds like exactly what we need." That night, however, proved considerably less quiet than either of them hoped. Garrick arrived at the private sitting room just as they had finally settled into a rare, peaceful silence together, his expression tight with fresh concern. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. We searched Crane's study as ordered, and found correspondence confirming his connection to the border mercenaries, exactly as the prisoner claimed. But we also found something else, letters exchanged with Lady Vane over several months, detailing plans considerably more extensive than tonight's failed seizure." Cade sat forward immediately, all traces of peaceful exhaustion vanishing. "Show me." Garrick produced a small bundle of parchment, and Cade read through it quickly, his expression darkening further with each page. "She knew everything," he said finally, disbelief and anger mixing in his voice. The border attack, the armory seizure, even the note left for Elira that first morning. She wasn't merely bitter and resentful. She was an active partner in all of it. Elira felt a chill settle over her, despite the warmth of the fire nearby. "Where is she now?" "Unaccounted for," Garrick admitted grimly. "She wasn't present at the estate when we arrived, and a search of her own chambers here in the palace turned up nothing but an empty wardrobe and a hastily abandoned room. It appears she anticipated tonight's outcome, and fled before we could act." "Find her," Cade said, voice hard with renewed urgency. "I want every gate watched, every road leading from the capital searched. She's proven herself dangerous enough that I won't rest easy, believing this threat has fully ended, simply because Crane sits in custody tonight." Garrick nodded and departed quickly to organize the search, leaving Cade and Elira alone once more, though the fragile peace of moments before had been thoroughly shattered by this new revelation. Elira reached for his hand, steadying him as much as herself against this fresh complication. "We knew this wouldn't end simply," she said quietly. "Crane's capture was one victory. It was never going to be the only battle left to fight." "I know," Cade said, exhaustion warring visibly with renewed determination. "I just hoped, foolishly perhaps, that tonight might have given us slightly longer to breathe before the next threat revealed itself." He looked at her seriously, worry sharpening his tired features. "Lorna knows about you, about what you mean to me. If she's fled rather than facing capture, I fear she may see you as a means of striking back before disappearing entirely." Elira absorbed this, fear tightening briefly in her chest, before resolve settled firmly back into place. "Then we'll be ready for that too," she said. "I didn't survive a wolf attack, a hostile council chamber, a border crisis, and Crane's arrest, just to be caught unprepared by Lorna Vane's bitterness." A tired, admiring smile finally broke through Cade's worry. "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose you did." He pulled her close once more, and though the night's fragile peace had been complicated by fresh danger, the steady certainty between them remained unshaken, a foundation neither Crane's ambition nor Lorna's hidden betrayal had managed to crack. Elsewhere, beyond the capital's southern gate, Lorna Vane rode hard through the darkness, a single loyal servant accompanying her, her carefully composed elegance replaced now by desperate, unraveling fear. She had watched from a hidden vantage point as Crane's estate fell, as guards loyal to the crown swept through gates she had once believed impenetrable, and understood immediately that remaining in the capital meant certain capture and whatever judgment awaited a confirmed conspirator against the throne. She had not planned for failure. Every contingency she and Crane had discussed assumed his ambition would succeed, that the border crisis combined with the armory seizure would prove enough to finally shift power away from a king she had watched grow increasingly distant from her over the years, increasingly enamored with a village girl who possessed nothing Lorna's own careful, cultivated breeding had spent a lifetime perfecting. The unfairness of it burned even now, fleeing through darkened countryside with everything she had built toward crumbling behind her. She had loved him once, genuinely, before ambition and bitterness had twisted that feeling into something colder, something willing to risk soldiers' lives and armed rebellion, simply to reclaim a place beside the throne she had always believed, quietly, belonged to her. "Where do we ride, my lady?" her servant asked, voice tight with barely controlled fear. Lorna considered the question for a long, cold moment, calculation already replacing panic, as her mind worked through the remaining options available to her. "North," she said finally, "beyond the treaty line. If Crane's mercenary contacts remain willing to deal, even after tonight's failure, there may still be a way to turn this defeat into something useful before it's finished entirely." Her expression hardened, resolve settling coldly over features that had once, briefly, held genuine warmth for the king now hunting her fall. "This isn't finished. Whatever Alira Voss believes she's won tonight, she has not yet seen the full extent of what I'm willing to do to reclaim what should have always been mine." They rode on into the darkness, leaving the capital's lights fading behind them, while inside the palace walls, Cade and Alira remained unaware of exactly how far Lorna intended to carry her wounded ambition, or how soon that unfinished threat would return, to test the fragile peace they had only just begun, however briefly, to believe they had earned. Arrows split the morning air over the northern training yard, and Alira dropped instinctively behind a stone barrier, as chaos erupted around her, guards shouting, horses screaming, the sharp, unmistakable sound of an ambush, unfolding in broad daylight, within sight of the palace walls. She had been walking with Mira, newly arrived from Miller's Row for a long overdue visit, when the first arrow struck the ground, barely a foot from her sister's feet. "Mira!" Alira grabbed her sister and pulled her behind the barrier, heart pounding, as more arrows rained down from the tree line, bordering the training yard. Guards scrambled to return fire, shouting orders, and within moments, Garrick appeared, shield raised, moving toward them with grim determination. "Stay low," he ordered, crouching beside them. This came from beyond the northern hedge. "Whoever's attacking knew exactly when you'd both be walking this path." The realization struck Alira immediately. "Lorna. We suspected she might attempt something once word reached her that Crane's trial had been scheduled," Garrick said, scanning the tree line carefully. "I did not expect her to strike this directly, or this close to the palace itself." The fighting lasted only minutes longer, guards eventually driving the small attacking force back beyond the tree line, though not before capturing one of the retreating attackers, wounded and unable to flee fast enough. Cade arrived moments later, having heard the commotion from the war room, his expression shifting from alarm to fury as he took in the scene. Alira and Mira, both shaken but unharmed behind the stone barrier. "Report," he demanded, though his eyes remained fixed on Alira until he was certain, beyond any doubt, that she truly stood unharmed. "A small force, likely no more than 6 archers," Garrick said. "We captured one alive. Given the timing, so close to Crane's scheduled trial, and the deliberate targeting of this particular path, I believe Lorna Vane has finally resurfaced." Cade's jaw tightened, cold fury settling behind his eyes as he crossed the distance to Alira, pulling her briefly into a fierce, relieved embrace, before turning his attention to the captured attacker being dragged forward by 2 guards. The man, bleeding from a shoulder wound, glared defiantly, despite his obvious pain. "Who sent you?" Cade said, voice carrying a hard, dangerous edge Alira had rarely heard from him. The prisoner said nothing at first, though after a long, tense silence, exhaustion and pain, apparently overcoming whatever loyalty he'd sworn, he finally spoke. "Lady Vane," he admitted. "She's been gathering mercenaries beyond the treaty line since the Baron's arrest. Paid us well to strike here, today, specifically targeting the girl." "Why today?" Cade pressed. "Crane's trial," the man said. "She wanted the throne distracted, wounded, before the verdict could be delivered. Said a king, grieving over an attack against someone he loves, would be too unsteady to preside properly, might even delay the proceedings long enough for her allies beyond the border to arrange something more permanent." Elira felt cold horror settle over her at the confirmation, understanding fully now how deep Lorna's desperation had carried her. Willing to risk open violence against a child, against innocent bystanders, purely to disrupt a trial that would formalize Crane's downfall. Mira, still shaken beside her, gripped her hand tightly, and Elira held on just as fiercely, grateful beyond words that the arrows had missed their mark. "Where is she now?" Cade demanded. "I don't know," the prisoner admitted. "She stayed beyond the border, coordinating from a distance. Didn't want to risk capture herself." Cade turned to Garrick, expression hard with resolve. "Double security around the trial proceedings. If Lorna intends further disruption, I want every possible avenue closed before she finds another opening." He looked back at Elira and Mira, worry and fierce protectiveness mixing plainly in his expression. "And I want guards posted on both of them at all times, without exception, until this threat is fully resolved." Elira nodded, too shaken to argue against the precaution this time, and allowed herself, finally, to simply lean into the comfort of his presence as the immediate danger passed, and guards began the work of securing the grounds fully. Crane's trial proceeded 3 days later, delayed only slightly to allow additional security measures, held in the same Grand Council chamber where his earlier challenge against Cade had unfolded weeks before. The chamber filled with elders, nobles, and curious onlookers, the weight of the moment pressing heavily over the assembled crowd, as evidence was presented methodically: the mercenaries' testimony, the intercepted letters between Crane and Lorna, the household guards who had confessed their role in the attempted armory seizure, once faced with undeniable proof of their baron's treason. Crane, stripped of his earlier composure, stood before the council with none of the calculated dignity he had once wielded so effectively, his face pale and drawn, as elder after elder voiced their judgment against him. Vessa, speaking last among the assembled council, delivered the final verdict with grave, measured authority. "Baron Aldrich Crane, this council finds you guilty of treason against the crown, of orchestrating violence against the realm's own soldiers for personal ambition, and of conspiring toward armed rebellion within these very walls. Your title, lands, and standing within this court are hereby stripped, effective immediately, and you are remanded to permanent exile beyond the realm's borders, forbidden from ever returning under penalty of death." Crane said nothing as guards led him from the chamber, his ambition finally, completely extinguished, leaving behind only the wreckage of a plan that had cost soldiers lives, and nearly cost Elira and Mira theirs as well. Cade watched him go with grim satisfaction, though the tension in his shoulders didn't fully ease, aware that Lorna remained free somewhere beyond the border, her threat far from resolved, simply because her primary co-conspirator had finally faced judgment. That threat resolved itself, unexpectedly, 2 weeks later, when word arrived that Lorna Vane had been captured, attempting to cross back into the realm, under a false identity, apparently having exhausted whatever resources and allies remained willing to support her cause, once Crane's downfall made clear how thoroughly their plans had unraveled. She faced her own judgment quietly, considerably less dramatic than Crane's public trial, and was sentenced to exile alongside him, her ambition and bitterness finally, fully spent. With both threats resolved, the capital settled slowly back into a fragile, hopeful peace, though the scars of the past weeks remained visible in reinforced border patrols, in additional guards stationed throughout the palace. In the careful, watchful manner, court members now regarded any ambition that grew too openly hungry for power. Cade worked tirelessly during those weeks to rebuild trust within his council, to reassure a realm shaken by treason and betrayal, that the throne remained steady despite everything it had weathered. Through it all, Elira remained beside him, no longer the uncertain village girl who had arrived overwhelmed by the scale of palace life, but someone who had proven, through crisis after crisis, that her courage and honesty belonged exactly where she had chosen to plant them. Mira, once the danger had fully passed, returned to Miller's Row for a time, though she made Elira promise, laughing through tears at their parting, that she would return often enough that the distance never felt permanent. On a quiet evening several weeks after Crane's trial, Cade found Elira in the same garden where Garrick had once told her that the king hadn't smiled so often in years, the last light of sunset, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and rose. He approached slowly, something nervous and hopeful visible in his expression that she hadn't quite seen from him before, not even during their most tender moments. I've been thinking, he said, about that first rainy night, outside the tavern. About how differently everything might have unfolded if you'd simply looked up, apologized, and walked away without ever knowing who I was. I think about that too sometimes, Elira admitted, smiling softly, though I've decided I'm rather glad I didn't look up. Some of my favorite moments since then started with me being far too tired and far too rude to notice I was standing in front of a king. Cade laughed, warm and genuine, before growing serious again, reaching for her hands with a tenderness that made her breath catch. I've spent my entire life being seen for my crown before anyone bothered to see the man wearing it, he said quietly. You saw only a stranger that night, and every honest moment since has only confirmed what I suspected from the very beginning, that whatever this realm believes, a king requires beside him, it was never noble breeding or careful political calculation. It was someone who would tell me the truth, stand beside me through danger, and never once let me forget that beneath every title, I am simply a man who wants, more than anything, to build a life worth living, alongside someone I trust completely. He knelt then, drawing a simple silver ring from within his coat, storm-gray eyes steady and certain despite the vulnerability plain across his features. Elira Voss, will you stay beside me, not as a village girl swept briefly into a king's world, but as my equal, my partner, and if you'll have me, my wife? Tears gathered in Elira's eyes, joy and disbelief, and a certainty deeper than any fear she had carried through the weeks of danger now behind them. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears as she pulled him up and into her arms. Yes, 1,000 times yes, though I still fully intend to wipe my muddy boots on your cloak whenever the mood strikes me. Cade laughed again, pulling her close, relief and joy and love mixing freely across features no longer guarded by the careful composure his crown had once demanded of him constantly. I would expect nothing less, he murmured against her hair. It's only cloth, after all, and I have already given you considerably more than that. Beneath the fading golden light of that quiet garden evening, with the threats of Crane and Lorna finally behind them, and an entire uncertain future stretching hopefully ahead, the Alpha King, who had never once brushed off the mud on his cloak, finally found the honest, steady life he had been searching for since that first rainy night, standing beside the one person in his entire realm who had looked at him and seen, from the very beginning, exactly who he truly was. News of the engagement spread through the capital within a single day, and unlike the hostile whispers that had greeted Elira's arrival weeks before, this time the reaction carried something warmer, something closer to genuine celebration. Soldiers who had fought beside her at the healing station in Ashfall Hollow spoke openly of her steady courage under pressure. Servants who had once delivered cruel anonymous notes now found themselves defending her honor against any lingering doubt from more traditional corners of the court. Even Vessa, upon hearing the news, allowed herself a rare, genuine smile, remarking to anyone who would listen that she had suspected as much since the very first council session, where a village girl's honest defense had helped steady a throne under siege. Mira returned to the capital for the wedding preparations, practically bursting with excitement at the thought of her older sister becoming queen, though Elira insisted, firmly and repeatedly, that titles mattered considerably less to her than the life she intended to build. Mistress Hale traveled south as well, grumbling the entire journey about her aching joints, while unable to hide the pride evident in every line of her weathered face, when she finally saw Elira again, dressed in fine silk rather than market-worn wool, standing confidently beside the man who ruled the realm. The wedding itself unfolded on a clear autumn morning, the palace gardens transformed with simple, elegant decoration that reflected Elira's preference for honest beauty over ostentatious display. Garrick stood proudly at Cade's side throughout the ceremony, having earned, through weeks of loyal service and quiet wisdom, a trust that ran deeper than simple duty. Vessa and the loyal elders who had stood firm against Crane's ambition watched with genuine warmth as vows were exchanged, the realm's future secured, not through political calculation, but through a bond forged in honesty, courage, and mutual respect. As the ceremony concluded and the gathered crowd erupted into celebration, Cade drew Elira close one final time before the festivities fully claimed their attention, resting his forehead gently against hers. "No regrets," he murmured. "About the mud, the danger, any of it?" "None," Elira said softly, joy and certainty steady in her voice. "I'd wipe my boots on your cloak again tomorrow, if it meant finding my way back to exactly this moment. He laughed, warm and unguarded, and pulled her into the celebration that awaited them both, a king and his queen, bound together not by crown or convenience, but by a truth neither mud, nor treason, nor ambition had ever managed to shake loose, standing now at the beginning of a life they intended to build honestly, together, for as long as they both were given to share it.